Joe Rogan Experience.
Train by day, Joe Rogan Podcast.
At this site in north of Pylos, and so we kept saying to ourselves, it's in the middle of a stone structure, and so we went back and forth on whether it's man-made or not. This circular depression. Geologists showed up. They said, nope, that part's not man-made. If you see what I mean, we listen and collaborate with geologists. Take on the Olmec heads, where he described them.
Headline.
So you want me to show you some tweets I've gotten from people that are fans of Graham Hancock
No. Listen, stop. Don't do that. They're not connected to him. They're just humans. There's a lot of crazy people in the world. This is you. We're talking about you.
Yes, but what I'm trying to say is that people misinterpret Graham. There's lots of people on the internet that think that he's talking about a lost white civilization.
Right, but this is something that you chose to highlight at the top of the page.
No, I did not highlight that at the top of the page.
Why is that like that?
He did that. That's actually near the end of it.
That's a quote from the article.
That's near the end of it.
But why is it up there like that?
I put it there.
You did it. Oh,
yeah.
Jesus.
I did not put that there
I'm
like
just
that.
I'm just taking an extract from Flint's article.
Okay, but you did print it. You did print that this sort of race science is outdated, long since debunked. What were you referring to when you said that, if you weren't referring to Graham?
I was referring to his take on the Olmec heads, where he described them as from an African culture. And he specifically took that from Ignatius Donnelly, who also described them that way, almost in the exact same words based on their facial appearances, despite the fact that Ann Cyphers has done excavation there and demonstrated with DNA and artifacts that these were indigenous people from that area in Mexico. And so that was an older essay that Graham has written, and that was what that quote was specifically relevant to.
But how does it reinforce white supremacist ideas that there were seafaring Africans?
Well, because again, it strips credit away from the people who actually did that.
Right,
so
but that doesn't reinforce white supremacy. It reinforces, look, if anything, he's trying to say that it was black people from Africa that were able to seafare and create these structures.
Some pretty silly stereotypes.
What do you mean about facial features?
Yeah.
But there's many people that have made those connections. Looking at those, they look Polynesian,
And
perhaps.
yet the people that have excavated it and done the DNA right at that site at San Lorenzo have shown that none of those people had African descent.
Right, but what are those structures representative of? Are they the people that were there?
Of course.
But is it possible
No,
that those
we have no
structures
evidence
are...
of African people.
Right, we don't have
America.
any evidence of it, but we do have the actual structure of those faces, and they do. I mean, be honest. They look either Polynesian.
I can bring up some.
They look fascinating.
Excuse me. I can bring up some imagery on that.
Okay.
And perhaps we'll do that next. But I would just love to just complete this little point that I want
Yes.
to make here, which is the influence of Flint and his colleagues on media and culture. And again, we've got the Society for American Archaeology, 5,000 members. Flint is one. Flint's co-author, John Hoops, actually helped to write this letter to the Society of American Archaeology. They're saying that I embolden extreme voices that misrepresent archaeological knowledge in order to spread false historical narratives that are overtly misogynistic, chauvinistic, racist, and anti-Semitic. I mean, you apply those labels to somebody and you're going to get that person hated by a lot of people.
Whole ball.
I did not write that.
No, your co-author, John Hoops, wrote it. We urge Netflix to add disclaimers that the content is unfounded. They want it to be called science fiction. In other words, that's a very clever way of cancelling me.
No.
Cancel culture at work.
Go back to that. Why would
And
someone...
here's Flint.
You're so much more of a celebrity than me.
Here's Flint. Netflix. Correct. I'm
Come
sorry.
on.
I'm sorry that I am, Flint. That's not really my problem. Hey Netflix, correct your mistake and reclassify ancient apocalypse as fantasy. Netflix, correct your mistakes. This is you pushing this. And then the general media, fishy Netflix show, Ancient Apocalypse, is the most dangerous show on Netflix. You used the word dangerous repeatedly in your conversation piece.
I don't think so. I don't think I've ever called you dangerous, Graham. I've not called you these things. You're misinterpreting me.
You don't think I've been. You don't think that...
I think that the way that you refer to archaeology as, you say that you're number one enemy of archaeology and things like that, you are promoting people to dislike what we do. We are doing our jobs. No, you started off Ancient Apocalypse by calling us patronizing and arrogant.
Archaeologists see me as public enemy number one. That's exactly
what
what
I started off by saying we're not sitting around thinking about you. Most of my dad's colleagues, when I mentioned I'm coming on here to do this, They had no idea you talked about the Ice Age. They
I'm
thought you
speaking
talked
of
about
archaeologists
pyramids.
like you, Flint, who see me as public enemy number one and who have quite a substantial outreach in the media.
It's again
Unilab,
right here.
pseudo-archaeology, as Dibble calls it, acts to reinforce white supremacist ideas. Flint Dibble interview Ancient Apocalypse, Graham Hancock, and conspiracy theories. I mean, what the fuck is the conspiracy theory? That archaeologists are conspiring against me, which I've never said or ever suggested.
You claim we're trying to hide the evidence,
No,
just
I
like
don't.
with Clovis First. We
Okay.
shut down all the alternative narratives.
Tell
That's
me
a conspiracy
where,
theory.
hang on, tell me where I've claimed that you hide the evidence.
You have claimed many times that we try to shut down alternative narratives, that we try to silence them. That suggests there's an archaeological conspiracy where we're all working together
No.
to have one narrative.
No, it suggests
Yeah.
that there's a strongly held point of view, there's a paradigm, and that those who go against the paradigm are likely to be attacked, like Tom Dillahay, like Jacques Cinq-Mars.
All of them still had successful careers for many decades.
But hold
Jacques
on, hold on,
Cinq-Mars
but don't-
excavated many other sites.
Right, but are you denying that he was attacked for the very thing that you're saying archaeologists don't do?
No, but I'm denying there's a coordinated attack. There
But
was
there's
no
a coordinated
coordinated
I've
attack.
never
attack.
said there's a coordinated
No.
attack.
Dillahay, there was not an attack?
No, of course
Was
not.
there more than one person?
I have no idea. This was before I was even
How
a
many
scholar. I was a
architects were
kid.
involved in this?
Hmm?
How many, when the people that criticized Dillahay, that went after him?
Oh, very large number. The Clovis First Lobby, the Clovis Police, as they used to be called by
So
other
it's not,
reviewers.
it wasn't
Well,
one
think
person.
about how many people actually study the Clovis period. That is a tiny period in one area of the world. The majority of archaeologists do not study that. Even Americanist
That's completely
archaeologists,
irrelevant.
most Americanist
It's
archaeologists
fundamental to
study
the
much
issue of
later
the
periods.
It's fundamental to the issue of the peopling of the Americas.
But it's direct. It's
And
also
the-
direct evidence of a group of archaeologists going after this one guy for saying something that turned out to be correct.
It's evidence of an academic argument, which happens, yes.
But
As
not that simple, right? Because he was correct, and they dismissed him. They wouldn't listen to his evidence, and he turned out to be correct.
What do you mean? He kept excavating that site. He invited people down there and convinced
But
them that
hold
he
on.
was right.
If they didn't listen to him, they didn't take the data, and they did dismiss him, and publicly, they still did all those things that you're trying to obfuscate.
I'm not trying to obfuscate anything. That's not fair at all.
But that would
he
but
invited.
what they did
It's
to
a famous
him is
event
the
from
thing
the
that you're saying.
1990s where he invited down a series of Clovis First people, and he convinced them at Monteverde. They came down there. They had a conversation. He showed them the evidence, and what resulted from that conversation was that entire group changing their mind on stuff. It was very. I'm not saying there were not a few bad actors. There's assholes everywhere. But what I am trying to say is that it's not some sort of conspiracy of everybody in archaeology against Dillahay,
But nobody
against
said
Graham,
everybody.
against
Nobody
whatever.
said everybody.
And nobody's saying conspiracy. I don't believe there's a conspiracy against me. I've said that 1,000 times.
You said you're public enemy number one.
Yes, I am. Clearly, Flint, to you, because you have, and John Hoops, for example, from the University of Kansas. I can play you some stuff from John Hoops too, if you want.
So what is this right here? It says to Graham,
so-
Jimmy, and others, we see you and will share with the world just how you try to bully and censor us. Who's trying to censor you?
Well, I'd argue that when people
This is
swarm me,
this is a quote from Flint Dibble, by the way.
Yeah.
well, there's times when people swarm me and they.
People online. You mean.
Yeah, of course.
Tweet people.
Yeah, exactly.
Don't read that.
Okay, I try not to, but I have a small Twitter account.
Yeah, but that has nothing. It's just people. It's just
Yeah,
random
I
people. When
agree.
you're public, okay, and you post something public, and you get involved in a discussion about some contentious issue that's public, the whole world can attack you. So try to connect that to Graham or connect that to anything. You're just dealing with people. He's not responsible for that.
I
You're
agree.
responsible if you engage and read it.
Flint, do you believe that there's such a thing? You know, we've all heard the word big pharma. Do you think there's such a thing as big archaeology?
No.
Oh, how odd. Because here you are, Flint Dibble, January 23rd, this is 2023.
Scare quotes. It's sarcasm.
The reality is we live in a period where we're seeing an increased distrust of scholars and scientists. As an archaeologist, I think we have to respond by engaging with the public, and we do. In many ways, the reach of big archaeology is way beyond that of Graham Hancock. Think about the millions of school children and parents who visit museums, etc., etc. You just told me you don't believe in the big archaeology, but right here you've said there is a big archaeology.
That's in quotes for sarcasm.
Oh, sorry, you lost me there.
That's
Because
okay.
you're saying so you don't think that the millions of school children and the teaching of archaeology, what archaeology teaches us about the past, forms the basis of the education system about the past. past, not people like me, people like you. That forms the basis of the education system about the past. Now, you like to present yourself as this small, lone voice, but frankly, by comparison with big archaeology, as you call it in your so-called scare quotes, by comparison with that, my outreach is very small, even on Netflix.
Graham, I was hoping we'd have a respectful conversation.
Yes, I was hoping that you would not disrespect me in the way that you've done.
I came here to
by
present actual
associating-
evidence, and I've done that.
Here you have Dibble exhorted colleagues to mobilize worldwide in the battle against pseudo-archaeology. If there's any conspiracy here, who's it against? Let's move on. Next one, Flip.
Are you having fun?
The ball's in your court.
The ball's in my court.
Yeah, go ahead. Say something interesting. Say something new.
Say something interesting.
Well, this is
Like, I came
productive
here to
way
have
to
a respectful
communicate, yeah.
conversation. I want to be very clear about this, Graham. I have critiqued the sources that you have used, and I've critiqued the evidence that you use. I have only met you for the first time today, so I do not know how you are as a person or how you treat other people. And so, to be honest, I think that you've just tried to go and smear me back for what you see as a smear on yourself. Fair enough. That's okay.
I'm just presenting facts.
Yeah.
What you actually said.
I'm presenting facts as well from archaeology.
Yes.
And I've shown you the kind of big data evidence that we
not
actually
being
have,
done in the
which
areas of the
disproves
world.
your entire civilization.
Let's have a look at. It doesn't disprove my entire civilization. How could you possibly do that when you've only investigated less than 5% of the continental shelves, 1% of the Sahara, 1% of the Amazon? How can you possibly disprove?
How can you claim there's an Ice Age civilization and ignore all the Ice Age evidence that we have?
The Ice Age evidence that you have, I don't dispute it. Of course there were hunter-gatherers in the world in the Ice Age. There's
Everywhere.
hunter-gatherers in the world
Everywhere.
now. I'm sorry, there's hunter-gatherers in the world now. There's hunter-gatherers in the Amazon rainforest. There's hunter-gatherers in the Namibian desert.
I mean, you
And we
start
coexist
off
with hunter-gatherers today. Why shouldn't an advanced civilization have coexisted with hunter-gatherers in the past?
I mean, look, as I've said, I think you have an issue with the sources that you cite, and I think that you have an issue with the evidence that supports your civilization. I think we should probably take a break and clear our heads.
I'm
Well, we
deeply
can certainly
unhappy.
take a break.
I'm
But for
deeply
you,
unhappy that you have associated me with white supremacism, racism, misogyny,
I mean, if you didn't
anti-Semitism.
know this, it was
and other
always the
labels.
same quote recycled. So I said something once, and then it gets recycled in like 15
I
different
understand,
pieces.
but you said it.
I did say it, and I said that there's this
kind
history of this idea which has been used by white supremacists, and that's an issue.
Right.
And I would like Graham to separate himself from that history in a stronger way, because he goes around the world to different cultures, and he claims that instead of their ancestors building this stuff, it was done by his civilization. They were the ones that taught people around the world how to do that. But does he do that in his own backyard? Does he go to Stonehenge and say that Stonehenge was built by this lost civilization? No, he says it was built by Neolithic British people.
Because I
And
wouldn't
so-
look for a lost civilization in northern Europe during the Ice Age.
Why not? We
Because
have
a lost-
hunter-gatherers there.
Yes, a lost civilization would not be choosing to live in northern Europe during the Ice Age. It was a frozen fucking wilderness.
Not everywhere.
Why would they want to live there?
Not after the last glacial maximum. We have people in the UK living there.
Well, it's not where I look. I look in areas, in underserved areas of the world. We
And
talked
so
about
this is
these.
an issue. We have
We talked about these mysterious strangers.
the lovely aspects of humans around the world, and then he goes around and tells people it wasn't their ancestors that did it.
No, I don't tell people that. I don't. I'm sorry. I don't.
He doesn't
I don't tell
cite
people.
a civilization that created.
I don't.
It could
He
have
cites the
very
civilization
well
as
been
teaching
the
people how to do
ancestors
it.
of the people that were there before
let
in the
me-
exact same area.
Let me summarize in very brief what I am actually saying. I'm saying that there was a cataclysm at the end of the last Ice Age, called the Younger Gyges. There are arguments about whether this cataclysm was caused by fragments of a disintegrating comet. This is the Comet Research Group. This is the Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis. But I'm saying there was a cataclysm at that time. There was a civilization. Now, it's you, not me, who say that that civilization was an empire. It's you, not me, who say that that civilization, had temples and was highly advanced and everything. I don't say that. I don't say that. I'm looking, in my view, what we're looking at is a civilization like all others that emerged out of shamanism, but that went a little bit further than some other civilization, than some other shamanistic cultures, that developed a highly advanced knowledge of astronomy, that was able to explore and map the world. And I'm saying that at the end of the Ice Age, that civilization was largely destroyed. that a very small number of survivors settled amongst hunter-gatherers as we would today. I've made this point before, but if there was a cataclysm on our planet today, people from our so-called advanced technological civilization would not survive it. We have absolutely no hope of surviving a global cataclysm like the end of dryness because we are spoilt children of the world. We do not have the survival techniques. The people in the world who know how to survive are the hunter-gatherers in the world. And if I were a survivor of this civilization, I would head for hunter-gatherers and I would try and make my home amongst them so that I could have some hope of surviving. And that's all that I'm suggesting, is that a civilization which had quite advanced astronomy, which was able to map the world, had a knowledge of longitude. I'm not saying they had machines, I'm not saying they had motor cars, I'm not saying they sent spaceship to the moon. I'm saying that they were destroyed at the end of the Ice Age, that there were a very small number of survivors, that those survivors settled amongst other hunter-gatherer peoples and benefited from their knowledge and exchanged knowledge with them. I am not saying that they introduced agricultural products to those people. I'm not saying they brought agriculture from where they came from. I'm saying that they helped to nurture the idea of agriculture amongst those people.
I suggest we take a little bathroom break, clear our heads, relax, come back, and let's discuss some of the ancient construction. Let's discuss.
Before we do that, can I just the
Yes.
issue of the Olmec heads?
Yes,
I have no view actually on what they are, but can I just show
Yes.
some pictures?
please.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let me get the. So these are the Olmec heads. Santa photographed these in Mexico way back in the early 1990s, and they're certainly intriguing looking. I'm not sure whether they're Africans, whether they're Polynesians, or whether they're Maya. They could well be Maya.
Olmec.
I'm just interested. Yes, they're Olmec. We have a strong connection between the so-called Olmec civilization and the Maya civilization. Maya, in a sense, are the inheritors of the Olmec civilization. I'm interested by things like this. I don't know what to make of them. These are Olmec figures from Trezopotes. In the center is a picture of Pharaoh Khufu wearing the Nemes headdress, and I'm just intrigued by the fact that these Olmec figures wear a very similar headdress to that. I don't know what to make of it. I'm not saying that ancient Egyptians went to Central America. I'm not saying that Central Americans went to ancient Egypt. What I'm suggesting is that maybe both of them inherited a shared idea from an ancestral civilization that was ancestral to them both. And then in the same Olmec culture, we have these images. On the left, the figure that's often referred to as the ambassador. And on the right, the figures called the danzantes, the dancer figures from Monte Albán. I mean, Flint, what do you make of these figures? What sort of ethnic group would you think they belong to?
I don't identify ethnic groups like that, man. Like, it's a stone carving. That's not how we identify ethnic groups.
No, I'm not actually interested. So good. So you don't identify an ethnic group, but what do you see beards on these figures?
Yeah, and people all over the world on every continent have beards from different ethnic groups.
It's just curious that amongst the Olmecs we have this, and we have this, and we have this, and I'm just intrigued by that. I don't
That
know.
people look
I don't,
different.
I don't know what it means,
Come on, man.
but I do find it intriguing.
And I see this as actually an example of the problems here because you cite Spanish colonial literature about, say, a white Quetzalcoatl coming. You talk about this as different kinds of people. Yes, you do in
We got
Fingerprints of
to
the
get
Gods.
correct on this. We've got to get correct on this. Are you saying that the whole story of the bearded, pale-skinned Quetzalcoatl was a Spanish invention?
Yes, I am. I can show you a depiction of Quetzalcoatl from the pre-Spanish period.
I can show
You want
you
me to show you?
depictions.
Wait,
I can show you
no.
depictions too.
No, can I please get the... Here we go. This is Quetzalcoatl on the Borgia Codex. This is from before any Europeans arrived in the New World.
Yeah.
This is on a hide. The ink has been analyzed, the hides have been analyzed, and this individual has tan skin, no beard, but a feathered headdress because this is the feathered serpent god.
Well, actually, we can't see anything from that image, but that's not the point that I want to make. The point that I want to make is, do you think that the Spanish deliberately imposed an idea of Quetzalcoatl on the
I think that
Mexico.
every single source that we have of white skin in indigenous Americas comes from Spanish sources, and therefore I
who
see
are
it as
quoting indigenous sources.
but quoting them inaccurately because people quote things in biased ways. This happens all the
How
time.
do you know they're quoting them inaccurately?
Because again, we have earlier representations
is there a
of these
document-
individuals
is there a
that show
document-
they don't have white skin.
is
This
there-
is the documents, Graham.
Is there a document against about this Spanish conspiracy?
Aw,
Do you
I had to
regard the
YOLO it.
peoples of
I had to
Mexico,
YOLO that one.
the peoples of
Had to.
Colombia, the peoples of Bolivia are so stupid that they would simply accept an imposition upon them by the
So,
Spaniards?
no, I think that interpreting these kind of sources is difficult. And so, Jamie, do you mind playing my video by Curly Tlapoyala? He's an indigenous archaeologist here in Mexico. He is a co-host of the Tales from Atlantis podcast.
How old is that?
It's from like the 14th century BC.
14th century AD, you mean?
AD, sorry, yes, I misspoke. Chill.
So this is pre-Spanish invasion?
Yeah,
Okay.
it's been dated and studied, the hides and the inks.
Is there others of Quetzalcoatl from that period, or before
Yeah,
that?
there's other Quetzalcoatl
And they
images,
are
and they're
similar?
all very similar. Yeah. If you go on Wikipedia, there's several images of him.
Okay, good.
I'm Curly Tlapoyawa, an archaeologist and cultural consultant specializing in Mesoamerica. I want to briefly touch on why expertise is so important when it comes to researching our ancestral cultures. And I'm going to use the example of a mistake involving the feast of Panquetzalistli, the Mexica ceremony celebrating the birth of the sun during the winter solstice. Panquetzalistli translates to the raising of the banners in the Nahuatl language. This refers to the multiple banners that are constructed to decorate the various temples and sacred centers associated with the solstice. Now, when the Spanish cronistas wrote about the feast of Panquetzalistli, they truncated the word Panquetzalistli to the first three letters, P-A-N, Pan, leaving us with La Fiesta de Pan, or the Festival of Pan. This shortening of words in colonial Spanish was pretty common, as paper was in short supply, and this was an effective way of saving space. Spanish friars had developed an entire method of shorthand to accomplish this. Well, the problem arose when a non-expert looked at these writings and didn't account for this shorthand, and La Fiesta de Pan became erroneously translated as Festival of Bread. Pan is Spanish. This simple mistake can cause this individual's research into Mexican festivals to go entirely off the rails, and it completely distorted the actual meaning of the festival, all because someone without adequate training decided to claim something without adequate evidence. Expertise matters, context.
It makes sense to me that if a group of people were conquered by white people who showed up on boats and dominated the society, that they would have a great influence on a lot of the myths and cultures. And not only that, but that they would heavily discourage deviation from the changes that they've made to those myths. And if you did that over the course of one generation, you would have a completely different narrative.
What intrigues me is that whether he's described as having white skin or a beard or not, we have a tradition of a civilizing hero, Quetzalcoatl in Mexico, Huachica in Colombia, Viracocha in Bolivia, depicted as a bearded individual who comes in a time of chaos, who teaches certain skills, and then leaves. This tradition is a Pan-American tradition.
No,
David Carrasco, I think you have to respect the work of David Carrasco, has drawn attention to this, and to the notion that the magical pen of Cortez could somehow have hoodwinked an entire continent into making up myths. And I just don't think that's credible at all. I don't
No.
understand what your video is telling us either.
My video is trying to explain the complexity of difficulty of interpreting Spanish sources. Can I show a different video that talks about the complexity of Quetzalcoatl as a figure?
Sure.
Can you play the video by, the one by Marika Stoll, but not the hallucinogens one, the other one.
Hello everyone,
So the key thing I'm trying to say here is that Quetzalcoatl, all these different figures, they're not all one thing that you lump together. There's a variety of different traditions. You pick and choose the one that you prefer for your story, which is fine. I think that your investigations and your beliefs are totally cool. I'm not going to convince you otherwise. Same with people listening. I'm trying to show the facts here and just how complex the situation is of indigenous myths, of archaeological evidence. We have a lot of different evidence.
A Pan-American myth of a bearded civilizer could not have been imposed on the indigenous population entirely by Spaniards. So that's my view. That's David Carrasco's view as well. Again, if you look at my response to the SAA's attempt to get Netflix to reclassify my show as science fiction, you'll find detailed information on that.
Do
Let's
you mind
move on.
sharing my screen really quickly?
Can I pause you for a
sure.
second though? We know that once indigenous people are colonized, that they try to at least alter their beliefs and if not indoctrinate them into whatever beliefs they have. And we have recent evidence from that in North America, how Native Americans were treated when they were put on reservations and brought into school systems and forced Christianity and told that they couldn't use their language. I mean, we have very recent evidence of human beings trying to impose their ideas on the people that they've conquered. It makes sense to me that that would be something that would also have been done by the Spaniards that entered Mexico.
Yeah. I'm not persuaded by that in this case. The myth is too widespread, and that constant reference to a bearded figure is very odd. As a civilization bringing it from the time of chaos and the time of disaster after cataclysm. Again, I mean, Flint and I can disagree on this. I'm intrigued by that information, and I don't think that the indigenous people of the Americas were so easily hoodwinked by the Spaniards.
I don't think it's hoodwinked.
Yeah.
It's conquered.
And I also think it's a lot more complex than that. So I study ancient Greek mythology, and you can see how these oral traditions change over time anyway, even without being conquered, right? You can see, for example, the weapons, the spears and the shields that Homeric heroes use. Sue Sherritt has an article on this. And so, you can see how Achilles' spear changes its description from a big Bronze Age style spear, the kind of spear that we see in Bronze Age graves. And then the next line, he has a smaller Iron Age style spear, the kind of thing that we see painted on Iron Age pots. And so, you can see how these oral traditions adapt to what's going on around them. And I think that that's important to recognize here with these kind of traditions that are written down by, Spanish-educated indigenous people and by Spanish priests as well.
Also, that you must take into consideration, I would imagine that a lot of these people can't read, and that they're actually probably not only being conquered by the Spaniards, but they're also being imposed upon with their language, which we know to be fact, which is why Mexicans speak Spanish.
Some of these traditions were recorded by Bernardino de Sahagún in 20 years of conquest. Bernardino de Sahagún is relied upon extensively by archaeologists.
Within
other
20
myths,
years after the conquest,
After
though?
the conquest.
Right, but you could do a lot in 20 years.
Okay.
And again, there's just no evidence for these kind of culture heroes with this color skin or those kind of
Let's take a
beards
bathroom
that
break.
are
I don't
less
care
like-
about the color skin. I do care about the culture heroes.
Okay, we'll take a bathroom break. We'll come back. Much more to talk about.
Thank you.
All right, we're back.
I'd like to pick up on this
Okay.
issue of Quetzalcoatl and on Sahagún and on the interpretation of indigenous traditions. And this is in my reply to the Society for American Archaeology and their attempt to have my series reclassified as science fiction, where they suggest that all these stories were made up. David Carrasco is a leading scholar of the Americas, and he writes, "I have no doubt that Cortes was striving to impress the royal mind with his extraordinary management skills, or that his literary craft was elegant and profoundly political. What is challenging to me is Glendinnin's, she's just another one of these archaeologists who say that it was all made up, Glendinnin's claim that this Spanish political fiction of both Quetzalcoatl returning and Moctezuma's vacillation and collapse was picked up by Sahagún, who powerfully reinforced it, erroneously thinking it was an Indian belief when in fact the ruler's gesture of abdication was a very late dawning story, making its first appearance 30 or more years after the conquest. The stunning implication is that this Spanish fiction, the story of Moctezuma's paralysis, parades down the years through the literature and scholarship and is internalized by commentators less wary than Clendenin, all the way to Leon Portilla, who falls unconsciously under Cortez's charismatic pen along with the rest of us. This means that Leon Portilla's extensive Nahuatl training and sense of the Aztec ethos, not to mention Sahagun's profound familiarity with Spanish native exchanges, contribute no effective critical stance in relation to the Spanish literary craft, which later Spaniards were not aware of and which a number of Indians internalized as their own. I'm quoting from David Carrasco here. I'm simply stating that this issue about Quetzalcoatl is more complicated than Flint perhaps wishes to believe.
Well, no, I've stated from the very beginning that it's extremely complicated, that there's a lot of different versions of Quetzalcoatl mythology, and so I think that it's wrong to say that there's only one version of that. And
I don't say there's only one.
Well, you only use one in your argument, and
That's
so
true.
I tend to think, though, also that this is fairly irrelevant at this point, because I think what we're still missing is any kind of accurate archaeological evidence with dates. So when you go, for example, to the Olmec heads, or you talk about Quetzalcoatl, or when you talk about any of the kind of evidence that you have in Yonaguni and underwater, we're still missing dates and how this relates to your larger hypothesis of a lost Ice Age civilization. And so I think that that's important to think about well-dated evidence. So do you mind if I go into my argument about the domestication of plants and food and things like that?
Sure.
Okay.
Could I just, since we talked about Danny Hillman and Gunnar Padam, I do have a major article on my site where Danny refutes the retraction of his paper. And there are some images with that, which will perhaps help us to understand what he's talking about. Sorry, I'm having to scroll through an enormous amount of material here. There's a very long article on my website.
Like you, I've probably created like 500 slides for this conversation.
This is not a slide. I'm live on my website here. I don't know how to get to the bottom of this enormous piece of work.
And you don't have a slider on the right-hand side?
I tried to use it, and when I used it, it did something weird with the screen. I'm very old tech.
Can you do like a search for a text?
Yeah, this isn't that.
I just want to get to the end. Yeah, I just want to show some of these pictures that Danny puts up.
Okay.
And I would urge those who are interested in getting into this matter in depth to look in more detail at what Danny has to say in this article. There's that so-called Kujang stone or man-made artifact. But it's really these are the different units that have been identified with the remote sensing.
Not actually with remote sensing. Those units were identified from the scarp that we used.
What are you trying to find?
I'm trying to find the original it's going to down column works. It's the way when you get down deep this material is referenced. That Danny and his team have concluded that even in the 27,000-year-old parts of Gunung we are dealing with man-made workmanship. I won't take it further than that.
Which flags are these? Are you talking like B8, B9, and B10?
Yeah.
And those are at 27,000 years?
He's pointing out that as we go deeper, we get material which is not in its natural formation, but is in a formation that was placed by human beings. And I would
Yeah,
evidence does
we
he have?
sort of covered that before, but like, yeah, what's showing that it was placed by human beings? Is this what they're? What was that last image that you had up there? A little higher up, above that? What is no above that? The one that showed that the outline of the area. What is that?
That's the 5 terraces. It's a terrace slope in a sense.
Right. So that's what has been.
That's
excavated.
that's what's been excavated by
And at the base of that, it's been dated to about 2100 years.
Yeah, exactly.
That's right, and Danny doesn't dispute that. It's the deeper material that's of interest.
Right, but what evidence is it that shows that deeper material has been manipulated by humans?
Well, if we can pause for a minute, let me run through this enormous article.
Is any of the evidence visual?
Yes.
So is it that same sort of thing, that like the imagery that showed?
Yes, it's like that Rorschach test is what I call
Right.
it. Yeah.
So it's
I'm sorry, it's too big. It's too big an article for me to go through. It's there on my website. It's Danny's retraction. It's Danny's refutation of the retraction.
But what are you specifically looking for in this?
I'm looking for his ground penetrating radar in his site.
Why don't you just do a search for ground penetrating radar on this page? Just, what is it, Command F? Chain of yep. Okay, ground penetrating radar. Okay, how many versions of it? There's two. There's only two.
This is the correspondence between him and the editorial team from Archaeological Perspective, which unfortunately ended up in the article being retracted
Which
instead of.
I want to point out, when I interviewed Dr. Yondri, his goal talking to me was to write a response. Like, we never got in touch with the Journal to retract. It was other people that did that. We wanted to write a response, and I think we're still aiming to do so. So that's our goal. Right? Yeah, I don't know
About
about the Mufadon.
Oh, what? How did I not get that door pressed? Like, come on, man.
Recently put up a major article
Fuck you. Like, fuck you.
concerning Göbekli Tepe and the issue of whether we're looking at a transfer of technology or gradual evolution or both. There's been a huge amount of research done around Göbekli Tepe.
What? Like, what?
Archaeologists have suggested that research vitiates my argument that Göbekli Tepe was a transfer of technology. I've been investigating that research in depth, and my view is it strengthens my argument enormously. But again, we're getting into material that's too far, too deep to go into here. I would just like.
No, I think we should get into
I'd like.
What makes you think it's a transfer of technology?
Well, I start off my Netflix series by saying it's an enormous site. You can't just wake up one morning with no prior skills, no prior knowledge, no background in working with stone and create something like Göbekli Tepe. There has to be a long history behind it, and that history is completely missing.
You mean the Natufian culture?
To me, it very strongly speaks of a lost civilization, transferring their technology, their skills, their knowledge to hunter-gatherers. And what I've done in this article is I've brought up to date my investigation into Göbekli Tepe. Of course, the Natufians are dealt with at great length in this article. How do I search Natufian? There are many predecessor cultures. The question is...
Who worked in stone.
Who worked in stone. The question is, when did this stone work? If you look at the research by Huckley and Gopher, for example, and of the introduction of geometric elements into the stonework in pre-Göbekli Tepe cultures, you find that almost all of it comes after the beginning of the Younger Dryas, not before the beginning of the Younger Dryas. There is an interesting development at Ain Malaha in Israel, also called Ainan, where some kind of geometric plan seems to have been put into place. But the bulk of the work, the bulk of the I hate to use the word that archaeologists dislike, a Neolithic revolution, but the bulk of the revolution took place after the Younger Dryas.
So that's why you think it's got to be transferred?
Yes, I do.
Except that the fact that there's no domesticated plants or animals at Göbekli Tepe. So if there's a transfer of knowledge, why are they not transferring agriculture?
Well, there was actually agriculture in Abu Huraira, for
But
example.
not at Göbekli Tepe.
No,
Abu
but
Huraira is a Natufian site
would you
that was occupied before Göbekli Tepe.
Would you find agriculture around Notre Dame?
Yeah,
It was a sacred site. Göbekli Tepe was a sacred site.
And we know that they're hunting gazelles by the thousands and harvesting wild
Yes,
plants.
yeah.
This has been published ad nauseum by people like Laura Dietrich, who have talked about the kind of plants that they're harvesting and the
Right, but
isotopes.
was it possible that they just didn't bring food to this area because
Yo,
it was a
something.
site for ceremony and ritual, and perhaps not at all for people to live in?
No, it
people
seems
to
more like
eat
they were
in?
there about half of the year. So they're there during the warm months. If you look at the harvesting season from the plant remains we have, and then the wild plants that are gathered, and then if you look at the isotope evidence and the mortality profile from the teeth of the animals that they're slaughtering, we see that they're there basically during the warm 6 months of the year. So this is
But
still
not at Göbekli.
at Göbekli Tepe I'm talking about. Yeah, for about 6 months out of the year, that's when people are there harvesting these. And so I sort of say they found an ecological niche, and they've learned how to exploit this. And to sort of stay there for half the year, they probably went to the lowlands during the other half of the year, which is a fairly common mobile pastoral or hunter-gatherer strategy, which is where you move to where the food is in different seasons, right? And so that area is a very naturally abundant area during the warm months. And so, you know, there's so much more that's under excavation right now by Lee Clare and other colleagues that shows sort of
Dude,
the
we like
spaces
summon Graham
around
Hancock
the
there.
ceremonial center that we have. I sort of think of it as like Washington, D.C. We have the ceremonial center in downtown, and then we have the less nice-looking areas outside.
Is it possible that there was a sophisticated culture that also was hunter-gatherers because the resources were so rich that they didn't need agriculture?
Yeah, I think that's what we're seeing in this period. Is sort of.
So there was no need to grow plants because
I think
plants
they
are
found a
plentiful.
successful niche,
Right.
and they really exploited it and did a great job with it. And so I think that that's what's going on right in this period. And it's also the period where we can start to see the start of domestication.
And so do you think that that also explains the resources that were required to build such immense stone structures, that they had the time to do this because they had abundant food?
Yeah, they had abundant food 6 months out of the year, and while they're there, they had the time to build those kind of structures.
But were they the first of those kinds of structures, you think they were?
Well, I mean, that's a tough question to ask. So, I mean, we certainly have T-shaped pillars from other sites in the region. In fact, there were some that were found by Klaus Schmidt before he found Göbekli Tepe at Navali Chori.
Which is a younger site. Navali Chori is a younger site.
It is a younger site, and so I think there's more investment. But what we do have is good monumental architecture from that period that we've known about for 60 years. If you go to Tel Es Sultan or Jericho, there's a pre-pottery Neolithic tower there. And so it's an enormous, not megalithic, but enormous monumental structure that we've known about in that area from the exact same period. And
So this is pre-metallurgy?
Alright, the water
this is all
ASMR.
pre-metallurgy.
Pre-wheel?
Yeah, well,
That's too
yeah,
funny,
probably
man.
pre-wheel, but
And
that's
where
tough
are they
to
getting
tell.
Dude,
these
come on,
stones
the
from?
dank, it
From
feels
the
dank,
area,
man,
most
with
of
the
it's gonna
hat.
be
Like,
local.
come
The
on.
quarries at Göbekli Tepe are right nearby.
And how do you think they moved those things?
You know, there's so many different ways to move large stones. There's been so many different experiments that show rollers or ropes. You can get enough people and know how, levers, and you can do that. And so, you know, there's so many videos on YouTube of Wally Wallington and others that show you how you can move stones weighing many, many, many tons.
I don't think there's any mystery around it. I don't claim that there is. I think what's intriguing.
I'll go back to Tepe, but there certainly is an Egypt.
Yes, Egypt's a bigger mystery.
Show us how.
But what intrigues me about Göbekli Tepe is the precision, the underlying geometrical plan of the site, and the astronomical alignments of Göbekli Tepe. And I think that the transfer of technology that I referred to did take place. It took place gradually. There's a site called Tal Karamal. We've spoken of Jericho. The Tower of Jericho is fascinating. It's a sort of Neolithic skyscraper in a way, but it's after the Younger Dryas. There's Tal Karamal, which has got 5 towers. Kotik Tepe, Bontuklu Tara, Abu Huraira. Abu Huraira is a fascinating site, and it was hit by an airburst. According to the team working on the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, Abu Huraira, the destruction of Abu Huraira took place because one of those comet fragments, 12,800 plus years ago, exploded over Abu Huraira within 100 or 200 miles of Göbekli Tepe.
Certainly a controversial point. I'm not an expert on this particular topic, but I know a lot of people that believe that the evidence is not there for the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis.
Yeah, there's a huge dispute going on about it. It's an
not my
interesting,
specialty though,
it's
but I
an
would like to
interesting
say,
discussion in science.
I would like to say that that destruction is an archaeologist's best friend. So when sort of a site is destroyed suddenly from earthquakes, from volcanoes, from warfare, from fire, it actually helps preserve material for us. And so, you know, if there is this kind of global catastrophe, that should make things more preserved and easier for archaeologists to find.
But isn't that dependent upon the scale of the catastrophe?
Well, no, because even like it's not going to be incineration everywhere, because we still have hunter-gatherer evidence everywhere.
Right,
And
but it could be incineration in a lot of places, and the hunter-gatherer evidence that you have is after the fact.
No, the hunter-gatherer evidence we have is from well before the fact as well.
As well.
Yeah, we
Right.
have hunter-gatherer evidence going back hundreds of thousands of years.
Right, but
And
when
in
you
all those
look at
periods.
have you seen the evidence of the Younger Dryas impact theory in terms of like iridium levels, nanodiamonds?
I'm not someone who's
AI
qualified
is
to be
just
able to
starting to
comment on
swear
that.
now.
I'm more thinking about it from an archaeological point of view, which is that if there was a destruction, just like with Pompeii or Herculaneum with the pyroclastic flow, that stuff helps preserve material for us. Same thing with earthquakes knocking over buildings.
Right. Would an atom bomb preserve material for us?
Yes, because the atom bomb, the very center of it might vaporize stuff, but then the whole area that gets abandoned afterwards because of the radiation, that actually is going to make that area an archaeological paradise for people once that radiation goes away.
But if Randall
gonna
Carlson's
be-
work on the impact to what was the ice that was covering North America,
In one small landscape.
what do you mean?
Meaning he
Oh,
talks
that
about
was
it in the
16.
Scatlands,
That was a
right?
16
Not
boost
just
out.
Scatlands.
Oh
He
my
talks
gosh.
about that, but he also just talks about that
Oh my
there's
goodness.
massive evidence of intense erosion.
That was a
So
16
very
boost
quick
out.
water flow that happened through an area that was
Wow.
absolutely devastating.
I mean, look, so the more rapid a destruction is, the better it preserves for us, just like with sea level rise.
Right, but dependent upon how strong the force is, right?
to
And if
imagine
there's
how-
something,
But if
to
it's a
imagine how-
global catastrophe, how is it so strong everywhere, yet it's not wiping out our evidence from hunter-gatherers at this exact same time? We have ephemeral traces, footprints, campgrounds, fires, and hearths. We have
because
lithics.
human beings did survive, right?
Yeah, but we have it from this exact same period.
Right, but human beings did survive at that same
And it
period.
didn't wipe out the traces of them from that period.
But the traces you're talking about are stone tools. And
Hearths, footprints, things like that that
Yeah.
are extremely ephemeral, animal bones and seeds. We have all of these things from the period around this supposed destruction.
but do you have them in the area where the supposed destruction
We don't
occurred?
know where the supposed destruction happened because
Right, but
nobody's
when-
ever found that.
But with Randall Carlson's descriptions of these massive floods of water, just hundreds of millions of pounds of water.
Well, let's go to J. Harlan Brett's, the one before Randall Carlson. I mean, the Channel Scatlands are an enigma. The massive water flows. I don't think anybody's disputing that massive amounts of water flow through there. It's a question of exactly when that happened.
Well, also, what would be left over in that area? There's not evidence of hunter-gatherers in that area from that
Well, I
time.
remember he showed, when he was here last, he showed sort of mammoth bones from that kind of period.
No, that was from Siberia, though, wasn't it? Was it from Siberia or?
I don't remember. But
It
it certainly,
wasn't
certainly,
from
it
the
certainly
Right,
wasn't
right.
from the Channel Scatlands. But let's cut to the chase here. 12,800, between 12,900 and 12,800 years ago, a very dramatic climate episode occurred, and that's called the Younger Dryas. The world had been gradually warming up before that, and then suddenly it went very, very cold. There is evidence of a 6-meter sea level rise at exactly that time, which is very hard to explain. But it looks like the suggestion is that that was due to impacts on the ice cap, on the North American ice cap, and perhaps on the European ice cap. The evidence for the Younger Dryas impact is found in what are called impact proxies, and that's iridium, nanodiamonds, platinum, melt glass like trinitite, found in sites across a vast area of the Earth's surface, 50 million plus square kilometers, an enormous area. Abu Huraira, next to Göbekli Tepe, happens to be one of those areas. And what they're suggesting is that a fragment of a comet blew up in the sky. It was an airburst. Exactly the same thing that happened over Tunguska in Siberia on the 30th of June 1908. That was an object that fell out of the sky, almost certainly out of the Taurid meteor stream, which is thought to be the progenitor of the remnant giant comet, because that's the peak of the Beta Taurids. It wasn't big enough to hit the Earth and create a crater. It blew up in the sky. When it blew up in the sky, fortunately over an uninhabited area of Siberia, it flattened 2,000 square miles of trees. It was absolutely catastrophic. If it had,
No, there is evidence.
there
for
is
that,
evidence
though.
for that.
No.
Compelling evidence.
There's not.
No, Vance Halliday and his colleagues just published a huge refutation of this entire hypothesis.
Of the
which-
what do they think?
No,
not the Tunguska, we're
event?
talking about the...
You're talking about the.
Younger
I'm sorry. Calling something a refutation doesn't mean it's a refutation.
No, but it still has not
We
been
have-
replied to. That's currently the
well,
record
actually,
of what there
it
is.
has been
Not-
replied to extensively by Martin Sweatman.
But are you referring to Abu Huraira? Are you referring?
I'm referring to the entire idea of the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis.
Right, but Tunguska, you're not. You're
No,
not.
I'm not debating Tunguska.
But that's what you were saying.
Then
He
I
was
misheard him.
Okay,
I
you
misheard
misheard him.
him. Yeah,
He
sorry.
was talking about the amount of forest that was flattened by the Tunguska
I
event.
misheard him. I thought
Right,
he was
and
talking
it
about...
did happen during the Taurid meteor shower.
I guess it happened
Yeah.
recently. 100 years ago.
Yeah, but it
happened in
did happen.
1908.
But it did happen during the same time of the year, where the Earth passes through.
Okay. Yeah. I'm
So-
not debating Tunguska.
Okay,
Yeah.
that
sorry.
was what it seemed like.
I
You were saying
apologize.
that
I think this would be a good moment for me to just give a little bit of information about the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis.
Okay.
Can we do that? Because it's very important to my feelings about
Okay.
it. God, these short sight. I tell you, being 73 is no joke. Yeah, so the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. Since 2007, it's been a compelling and fairly documented case. It's been put together by more than 60 eminent scientists. Of course, some scientists oppose them as well. It was hit 12,800 years ago by multiple fragments of a disintegrating comet. Mark Boslow is one of the authors of that refutation piece that you've just put in. Here he is saying that Graham Hancock's use of impact hypothesis in Netflix is all wet. Here we have a post responding to that. Graham Hancock is a charlatan and a fraud. Younger Dryas impact hypothesis is widely debunked. I'm sorry, it's not. If you want to learn about the work done, go see Mark Boslow. Here's that paper you're talking about, Flint, the comprehensive refutation of the Younger Dryas hypothesis. Because something is called something does not mean it is something.
Have you read it? It's fairly detailed.
I have read it in great detail, and I've also read James Lawrence Powell, who the authors of this paper largely ignore, but who is a highly respected figure, and in whose view the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis has been prematurely rejected. Bill Napier is a member of the Comet Research Group. He's the person who's connected it to the Taurid meteor stream. He's talking about the evidence of a large comet about entering the inner solar system about 20,000 years ago, going into fragmentation, creating a wide debris trail through which the Earth passes twice a year. And it's a catastrophe of celestial origin which occurred around 12,900 BP, before the present. Now,
I don't think it's
referring
it.
to a refutation paper, but would
I
you
don't
really
think it's it.
so quickly accept it when you look at the credentials of the people in the Comet Research? I mean, James Kennett, marine geologist, professor at the University of California, he's a world expert in paleoceanography. Dr. Richard Firestone, James Whitcomb, Albert Goodyear, Alan West.
it
There
might
I am
be.
with Alan West.
It might be. That ending was pretty good.
In Murray Springs. The Younger Dryas boundary is full of the signatures of a massive cosmic impact, probably an airburst, rather like the
It was
airburst
a little
that took place
cleaner.
on Herrera. I'm not expecting anybody to read these papers I'm putting up here. I'm just saying that the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis has been widely published, extensively published over the last decade, that there's a huge amount of information in support of it. There we're looking at the Younger Dryas boundary field extending on the right as far as Abu Huraira, and on the left covering most of North America. It's also found in Belgium, by the way. It's found in the deep south of Chile. It's found in Antarctica. It's found all over the world. This platinum anomaly, documented at the Younger Dryas onset, is particularly important. But the evidence of a cosmic impact at Abu Huraira, that one, I mean, we know that Michael Shermer is an opponent of my work. But even Michael Shermer, in my view, by the way, and I want to thank Michael for this, a true gentleman. When he realizes he's got something wrong, he says so. And here he says, in the light of the work at Abu Huraira, he says he's going to address his priors about my theory in the light of this evidence from a massive cosmic impact over Abu Huraira. The fact that a paper has been published which claims to refute the Younger Dryas impact is really not anything at all. The question is, what's the depth to that refutation? Is it a solid refutation? Does it really work? And why is it that the same team who claimed to have refuted the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis in 2023 also published a requiem for the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis in 2011? Clearly there was something wrong with their 2011 requiem.
I am not a scholar that focuses on these kind of questions. I focus on archaeological evidence, so I'm going to try to reply from that perspective. And so one of the examples you give is if this is Abu Huraira, for example, the site is still there for us to excavate.
Indeed.
We understand that it has some of the earliest domesticated crops there. And so the entire point is that this kind of, even if this hypothesis is true, it would not have wiped out the evidence for the civilization that we're looking for. Because we can see very clearly that if it's true at Abu Huraira, it did not wipe out the entire settlement. It's there. We're excavating it now.
Isn't Abu Huraira one of the first places that show evidence of real agriculture?
Yeah, so let's talk about some
That's
real
part,
agriculture.
that's part of the evidence I'm
Yeah,
talking
so
about.
can we talk about some agriculture?
Sure.
All right, cool. Can you boot up my
You got all excited.
Yeah, this is like my stuff finally. I did my dad's stuff earlier, now I get to do some of my stuff. In fact, this is some of the sites I work on. Okay, I want to be clear that we have a lot of evidence for ancient plants and seeds, right? I'll show you the statistics, we have hundreds of thousands, millions of these just from the time period of thinking about domestication. So how do we even collect tiny little seeds of grains and beans and peas? Any idea, Joe? Okay, so you know how wood floats? So does carbonized plant material. So basically we collect samples from every single unit that we excavate, and we put it in what's called a flotation tank, where we pump up a bunch of air to separate any charred plant material from the soil and sediment. And then it sort of drains out right around here into a mesh, and then we can start to study it under a microscope. All right, big question. What the heck is the difference between wild and domesticated wheat? Any ideas? No? Graham?
Yes, the domesticated wheat depends on human beings helping it continue.
And how do we identify that? Okay, that's important though. So all right, let's go to the bottom here. It's the scar, right where that wheat kernel or the spikelet of the wheat seed is attached on, it attaches to the plant. And the reason for this is in wild
Come
plants,
on,
like
like give me
weeds
the
or
B
beans or
press.
peas,
Like, come
it's
on.
gonna propagate itself by falling off the plant easily. If birds or humans are harvesting it, it's not that it wants to, it doesn't have agency, but it propagates itself more easily by shattering easily off of the stem of the plant. On the other hand, as soon as humans start gathering it, that does nothing, because some seeds fall, it replants itself in the field. But as soon as humans start gathering it and planting it in new fields, then all of a sudden there's an evolutionary sort of impact on the plant itself. And so what's selected for is the mutation for a seed that hangs onto the plant. Do you see what I mean? Because you're cutting off the plant, taking it with you, and then planting it somewhere else. And so this is a shift in grains that we call a brittle to a tough rocket. And you can see it's kind of a clean scar right here on the left in wild wheat, while it's a much sort of tougher scar on the right.
Do we know what the evolutionary mechanism is that would cause it to do that?
Yeah,
to
so there's
change like
two
that?
different genes that actually control this in wheat, for example. And so we actually know, just statistically speaking, and by sampling wild wheat today, that this is going to exist within any field of wild wheat. There's going to be a few seeds with this genetic mutation. And then as soon as humans start collecting it and cultivating it, planting it somewhere, it's going to automatically put evolutionary pressure on that. And it's over time. And we see this shift from shattering to non-shattering in barley, in wheat, in rice, in every single grain species that we have domesticated. And so you can see this statistically, for example, in China, where over time, A, we have 35,000 of these now that we're studying. B, you can see the population of rice at archaeological sites. It starts off mostly as brittle, meaning it shatters easily, and over time it takes about 1,500 years for rice to evolve to become fully domesticated, where it hangs onto the plant more easily. And so we see this repeatedly. We could see this later on in the Holocene. So we're talking several thousand years later, like 5,000 years ago, in sort of the Sahara Desert during the Green Sahara periods, where we see the domestication of pearl millet. Same exact transition is what happens. And you can see the statistics of it happening, changing statistically over time, the population of millets in these regions from, you know, a brittle rachis that breaks off easily to a tough rachis where the seed hangs on.
How does it figure out that?
It's just selectionary pressure. It's the pressure of humans now collecting it and then planting it. So as soon as there's one seed that's like that with that mutation, it slowly proliferates every single time humans replanted it in a new field.
And it just takes.
Yeah, it just takes thousands of years. Yeah. And we see this in wheat, barley, rice, oats, teosinte, which becomes corn. We see it in millet, sorghum. We see it with the pods for beans and peas. So the pod changes how it breaks off the plant. And again, it goes from shattering to puff. And so we see that with lentils, chickpeas, peas, common beans, runner beans, soybeans, fava, vetch. All of these species, dozens of them, it's the first sign of human domestication. And so that's what we can see. The second sign is
How
actually
many? I'm sorry. How many thousands of years does it take before this starts showing?
something. Well, it starts showing up fairly quickly, immediately. So you get small percentages of it. For example, you can see this with the rice graph here, with all of them. So at Abu Huraira, for example, it's a small percentage of the crops that are actually have this feature.
So it looks like just 150 years it starts changing.
Yeah, it slowly starts changing over. In fact, Gordon Hillman first worked out this would happen really rapidly, that it would take just a few hundred years for the population of these plants to change over. Now we know it takes a few thousand years for it to the full population at archaeological sites to go from wild, breaking off easy types to domesticated, hanging onto the plant types.
That is fascinating.
Yeah.
It's fascinating how the plant somehow or another adapts and figures it out. This is the way to survive.
It's really cool because it's not human selection either. In fact, 40 years ago when we first started studying domestication, we thought that all this was due to conscious human selection. And now we know that it's actually the plant adapting to us and what we do. Yeah, it's cool as hell, isn't it?
I agree with you on all of that. I don't want to stop you with your presentation, but how does that, what bearing does that have on getting rid of a lost civilization?
I'm going to get there. Like, again, it's not about getting rid of the lost civilization. I'm actually here to show that there's no agriculture at all in the Ice Age. And it doesn't have to do with the lost civilization. But that's a key component of your civilization. So the second
Well,
trait...
there's no agriculture at all amongst the Inuit either, right?
No.
Right.
But
They survived.
But in his books and in his Netflix series, he describes this civilization as introducing agriculture. He talks about seed banks and things like that. In Magicians of the Gods. I have a quote in here.
Show me.
Okay, you want me to?
Yeah.
Yeah.
See it. I want to see it.
Give me a second. It seems fanciful to you want to use it? I can't do your accent.
You want to read it?
It seems fanciful to imagine that we might, in an almost high-tech sense, be looking at the specifications and see. Oh, this is from Fingerprints of the Gods.
No, it's from Magicians of the Gods.
Oh, maybe I repeated it in Magicians. And this is about the underground Vara that Yima is said in myth to have created following a disastrous cataclysm.
So is it possible that this cycle of domesticating weeds and beans and all these different things has taken place many, many times? And that if you left them alone, they would go back to the wild form, where if there was a disaster and people stopped growing them in this particular region, how long would it take for them to revert back to their original
Thousands
state?
of years again.
Thousands of years again.
Thousands of years.
How many
'cause of
thousands of years do you think?
Well, I don't know because I'd have to look that up because I know that we've observed this kind of stuff, feral, domesticates going feral, but I don't have that off
And you
the
said
top
how
of my
many years from the original till the whole crop?
Something like 3,000 years.
3,000
Dorian
years.
Fuller's actually published a lot on estimating the time ranges
Right.
of this.
So if you had agriculture in 12,800 years ago, around the time of the Younger Dryas impact theory, and then people are resorted to hunter-gatherers again, it takes a long time before they start using agriculture again. Is it
That's not what
possible?
he's claiming. He's claiming that
Yeah, I know, but I'm
yeah.
asking. Is it possible that those plants
one
would
thing I'm-
revert and
one
then the
thing I'm-
process would happen again once people started growing them intentionally?
That's tough to tell because what we see is it's exactly at that time, at least in Southwest Asia, where this domestication starts.
Or
So
we
it's-
haven't seen the reverse happen.
No.
But is it possible?
Well, I mean, it would have had to have happened a lot earlier.
But
you see
if
what I mean.
people weren't cultivating it anymore, wouldn't the natural selection revert
Yes,
back to the
it
original
would.
state?
I agree with that. It would revert back.
But it would take a long time.
It would take a long time. And so I want to get into how the next trait size takes thousands of years after that, which is the selection for large seeds. So we measure these seeds, and we can see their change over time. And I have here a really cool...
Is this a selection by farmers and by people that are...
That's such a great question because actually we think at first it's not. So this is the plants adapting to the fact that they're being planted in plowed and tilled and cleared fields. And so
They have more
larger
resources?
seeds... No, larger seeds actually grow faster. So they outcompete their neighbors that might have been planted with smaller seeds.
Oh, because it's monocrop, because they're constantly surrounded by other plants that are similar, and so they're competing for resources.
They're competing for resources, and the ones with larger seeds on average grow. So this is done from a lot of experimental archaeology. Yeah.
So wild.
Glynis Jones, Dorian Fuller, and others. Glynis Jones at Sheffield, who's retired now, has taught me this stuff.
That is so, just the fact. I mean, I know we're in the middle of this crazy debate, but just the wonder of nature itself, the complexity involved in these natural life forms that adapt to their environment is so fascinating. And the fact that it's such a contentious issue amongst biological creatures, specifically human beings, because of religious implications. But if you just look at it in terms of what we know for sure with plants, It is such a bizarre process. It's so fascinating and complex, and there's so much going on. And just with our understanding of the communication that plants have with each other through mycelium and the different organisms that exist in the earth, and that they're sharing resources, and like, what a bizarre, fascinating world.
Almost mysterious.
Oh
There's
my
a lot to
God,
learn.
So mysterious. Oh,
And
well,
I-
there's a lot to learn for sure, but
I think that's what's cool because we have this kind of stuff. So you asked about selection.
yeah.
So this is a maize cob from about 1250 AD. This is part of the Southern Methodist University Archaeological
That's how
Research
little they
Collection.
were back then.
That's
Isn't
how
that
little
wild?
they were. So if you want to hold it, you can.
Sure, yeah. How old is this?
That's from about 800 years ago. Yeah. And
It's
so I want to thank
was this
Matthew
a
Berlinger.
full
Yeah,
piece
that's
of
a
corn?
full cob. Yeah.
Folks, this is like a thumb. Not even my thumb. It's like one of my smaller fingers.
And just to get
This
a
is
sense
crazy.
of
Like, they think of a corn cob today. It's just, I mean, I had one over Thanksgiving. It was massive. It was like this big.
yeah, exactly.
We
Now
grow 'em
that's
like
human
a
selection.
forearm now.
That's human selection at that point. Yeah.
Crazy. That's amazing.
And to give you a sense of just how much we find, this is our charred.
Wow.
Southern Methodist University.
How old are these?
So this, they're not exactly sure where they come from. They think they're subsampled from collections at Pop Creek Pueblo in New Mexico. So several hundred years old for sure.
They're so little.
But yeah, they were collected a long time ago, so they're not sure. Yeah,
Just the kernels are so tiny.
And the
are
only
these
way-
like dehydrated?
They're
or
charred.
They're charred, right? But would
that's
they be
how it's
larger?
surprised. Yeah, they probably would have been larger. So we study how charring impacts these things as well. Yeah, so we do a lot of experiments to understand that, so that we can see the shape and the size and stuff like that. So to get back to your question though, because I think you asked a good question. When we think about sort of this change over time with domestication, we also see a change in time in the kind of stone tools that people are using. So it takes thousands of years before we start seeing these sickle-type blades associated with harvesting these crops, right? And then the next step we can take is this introduction, this sort of transfer of technology that agriculturalists do when they move into Europe and elsewhere. And we can track this in real time. So this is from a project, I was actually doing the flotation to collect the plants from this project when I was a student, and this is in Albania, directed by University of Cincinnati. So these are the trenches that we excavated. But this is one of the earliest agricultural sites in Europe from about 6400 BC, right? And what's really cool is we can see what this kind of introduction looks like. We see a full package introduced at the same time. We see multiple different domesticated plants, multiple different domesticated animals, as well as new types of artifacts like stone tools and pottery of different types than what the hunter-gatherers were using there. And so this is kind of the parallel. This is where we see this transfer of technology, is when agriculturalists spread out and they take a whole package with them. We call it the meal of the package, right? And so that's one of the key things, is we have parallels for this. And so when we go back to this sort of end of the Stone Age type period, where we're maybe looking for something like a seed bank or a shelter that's keeping these Noah's Ark or something like that, what we can also look at is it doesn't look like anything's introduced. These plants and animals get domesticated in their natural regions where their wild progenitors were growing and living. And so there's not like an introduction of a new species that was not there. Instead, we already saw these wild plants in place in the Ice Age in these spaces, and then we can date directly these with radiocarbon, right? There's no reason to assume anything else. We date plant remains and bones directly. And then lastly, I just want to talk about not archaeological evidence, but paleoecological evidence. So these are kind of cores taken in lakes, lagoons, swamps, on the sea floor, and this is what a palynologist, so those are people that study pollen, look at. And so this map is from an article that I was actually a co-author on, looking at different paleoecological proxies around the Greek peninsula. So we're
Is
looking
that a real image of pollen?
Yeah, this is pollen under an electron
Yo,
microscope.
what's up, buddy?
From Dartmouth College, I think it is, this image. And so, you know, we have these kind of cores that give us a sense of the landscape. And, you know, we can track, for example, the rise of different agricultural societies from pollen that floats through the air. We can track, for example, tree crops when they start getting introduced and when they become common. We can track grains and when they come in and become very common in these different regions. And the key thing I want to draw your attention to is a lot of these proxies, these cores, are taken from coastal areas. And some are even taken from underwater. So we have underwater cores from the seabed and we can reconstruct these sunken landscapes and this sort of ecosystem that was there. And nowhere do we see an ecosystem of agriculture, arboriculture, or anything like that. Instead, we see very natural landscapes, the type of landscapes that hunter-gatherers would live in. And so this, I think, is really important because there really is, it's not just that there's no evidence for agriculture that early, we have evidence against it from those pollen cores, but also this article by Peter Richardson and colleagues points out that agriculture, it was probably too hostile of a condition for agriculture in the Ice Age. The reason why is because there's too little CO2. Plants need carbon dioxide to be able to propagate and grow and be grown intensively in particular. It's also a period of aridity. It's very dry because so much of the fresh water is trapped at the poles in the ice sheets.
Yeah, but this is not the case of the Amazon, right? And the equator, the environment would be different.
But we have pollen cores from those areas, and again, we have no evidence of any kind of intensive agriculture.
Vastly understudied areas.
Yeah.
I never
But they
claim.
are vastly understudied, right? I mean,
Well, sure,
you're
yeah.
not laughing,
You have to
but
imagine that a pollen core is actually tracking a larger landscape, right? Because pollen travels really far. And so you're able to, with one core, track a much larger landscape and put that together. And so, you know, I just cannot emphasize this enough. We need to, I have a phrase I like to use about archaeology. We work from the known to the unknown. So this is true when we excavate. We come down on the stub of a wall, and we change what we're doing to follow what we know, which is that wall, and we expose it. When we found the Griffin Warrior tomb of Pylos, for example, we found the corner on the very first day. And by the third day, we already expanded the trench so that we could catch what we know is there. And so it's the same kind of thing when you dig a layer. It's the same thing when you sort of test a hypothesis like Graham's, which is we want to work from what we do know. What we do know from the Ice Age and what we do know from right after this period of domestication. And so what we do know is all this kind of natural evidence about the climate, about the
What?
ecology,
How did it not
and about
push the
how
door again?
domestication actually happens. And so
What?
that's why I think that, unlike the other part with the Ice Age sort of coastal stuff, I think that's sort of like, why do we keep finding tens of thousands of Ice Age sites that are hunter-gatherers? It's a bit of a coincidence we don't find your civilization. Here,
It's not tens of thousands, it's 3,000 sites.
that's not true. We have 13,000 different sites in the Paleolithic radiocarbon database.
No, I'm talking about underwater.
Okay, but we have 3 million shipwrecks that have been mapped,
Not relevant.
according to
my argument.
UNESCO, and they're on the continental shelves.
Can I pick up on some points you've made, or are you not quite finished yet?
Sure, you can pick up then.
I don't ever claim that very small numbers of survivors of my proposed lost civilization introduced plant species.
Alright, I'll just say he's very close-minded. He's a very close-minded individual.
There is evidence of
Like, usually you wear that hat because of the sun,
20,000 years ago.
not when you're like indoors.
Gatherers.
I'm not judging, but
Yeah, of a hollow too.
Yeah.
They weren't. It wasn't. It never reached the stage of domestication.
Yeah,
And
they're gathering, not planting.
that goes back 24,000
it's
years
like as
ago.
if someone
They
showed up
gathered,
wearing like
but they did not
sunglasses.
domesticate. There are a number of attempts at domestication, but it's after the Younger Dryas that we see this sudden surge in domestication. Now, I'm not saying, and I've never said, and you will not be able to find a quote where I've said that they introduced agriculture. They introduced the idea of agriculture.
Yo, what's up,
We're talking
Goose?
about a very small number of people. The myths speak of 7 sages again and again in multiple locations around the world, bringing the idea of agriculture, but that agriculture is then applied to locally available plant species. And we do then see the long process of domestication beginning after the Younger Dryas, not before it. We don't see that domestication occur
Imagines
before.
he's writing in his
See
own
some
diary.
attempts at gathering crops.
We're
We
all
see
gonna
some
make it, bro.
machine on sickles that show that people were cutting wild grasses and using the seeds. We do see all of that, but we don't see domestication. The steps that begin to lead us towards domestication begin after the Younger Dryas, and I think that's the elephant in the room. I think that what happened there during the
Yo, what's
Younger
up,
Dryas
guys?
is
Everyone's up
extremely
late tonight.
mysterious,
I
and don't
napped
think
for
we have the
like
whole
fucking
story. And I'm simply proposing
5
that
hours.
the survivors of a civilization who were in very small numbers, traveled around the world seeking refuge, sharing their knowledge with those they took refuge amongst, and sharing the knowledge of those they took refuge amongst. It was an exchange, not a one-way trip, and they did not bring plants and seeds with them. They worked with what was locally available, and that's precisely what we see happening after 12,900 years ago in this whole area of hundreds, thousands of square miles around Göbekli Tepe, going right down into the Jordan Valley. Abu Huraira being a particularly interesting example, very close to Göbekli Tepe, is the first steps being taken towards domestication. There have been multiple attempts to harvest wild grains before that, but no domestication. Suddenly we see the domestication happening, and of course it's happening with locally available plants. I've never said that they introduced plants.
I am, my man.
But if they're introducing the technology of agriculture, that would imply that
I
they have
am,
to
buddy.
actually-
Thanks, man.
Which is I'm trying to show does not. It doesn't make
It's
any
moving
sense. You need
forward.
to invent new species of plants. You need to go
I'm
against
working
all the other.
on getting the visa,
Why do you need to?
Well,
invent?
because
They were, they
if
were
you look
using,
at
they
where
were
getting
using
my
wild grasses
documents ready.
in the area.
Thanks,
of,
buddy.
of where
And
they
the
were.
Hollow too in the
Thanks,
Jordan
man.
Valley. They were using them 23,000
Yeah, in the
years
Appreciate
area
ago,
of
that.
those wild
but
plants.
they did not domesticate them.
But then, what was your civilization grown?
I don't know.
Yeah, man. Dongy.
What I do know is it's very. I don't know. What do you not understand about the word lost? I don't know what they were growing. But what
Good
I
old
understand
dongying.
is this sudden surge towards domestication, which you rightly say is a long, slow process. It doesn't happen overnight. It takes a long time, but we see those first steps being taken after, not before, the Younger Dryas.
And
that's
it's not
where
so sudden. We're talking about thousands of years
Yes.
when agriculture starts in different places. So it's very early in Southwest Asia, but it's a 1,000 or plus year lag in East Asia or Mesoamerica. So when people say suddenly, I think that's a misinterpretation of the evidence. In
What
terms
I'm
of
ref-
human generations,
what I'm
we're
referring
talking
to-
hundreds of human generations.
What I'm referring to suddenly is the transition from harvesting wild grasses to setting in process a project that will lead to domestication of wild grasses. And that cannot be demonstrated before the Elder Dryas. It can only be demonstrated after the Elder Dryas.
It's not a
And that's-
project. It's just planting them in the ground.
And that's why I think that there's something odd about the Elder Dryas episode. And to me, that's something odd when I combine it with mythology from all around the world about the destruction of a great civilization in a global cataclysm, about the fact that there were a few survivors, about the suggestion that they traveled around the world sharing their knowledge and ideas. That's why I think that the spark for the agricultural revolution that we see in that area was introduced. Not the agriculture itself, not the plants themselves. They used locally available plants. They'd be daft.
But to play devil's advocate,
Yeah.
if they did do that, wouldn't it would immediately show up as agriculture?
No,
Why would it take thousands of years for it to take hold?
because it takes a long time to domesticate. It's not simple.
But you see the shift starting immediately.
You see the shift in 150 years.
And you
Yeah.
see it,
And-
immediately at Abu Huraira.
How are you,
Yes,
Goose?
and then
Hope you're
elsewhere,
well,
not
bro.
as early.
But is it also possible that the Younger Dryas impact theory affected the climate and it made agriculture more possible, and then they figured it out after that because it was colder before that, right?
Yeah, we've had lots of cold periods.
Oh, wow. Legend. That's cool.
400,000 years or so.
Right, but
I
that's
wouldn't want
different. That's a different species
That's cool,
of
dude.
human almost.
No.
They had 400,000 years ago.
400,000 years ago.
Right,
Yeah,
but
buddy,
they hadn't
nice.
figured out anything that we
The
figured
earliest,
out.
Full moon
the
energy.
earliest evidence so far for anatomically modern humans is from Jebel Hud in Morocco. It's about 320,000 years old, 315,000 years old, something like that. Anatomically modern humans. So I think it makes sense
Right,
to
but they hadn't. But my point is, they hadn't figured out anything that we figured out.
no.
So
they,
wouldn't
they,
it make sense that at one point in time, the human species would figure out agriculture, and if that transition would take place for over a period of thousands of years after a massive shift in the climate?
the mystery to me is why during the previous massive shift in the climate that took place multiple times over the 400,000
Because
years.
humans hadn't evolved to do any of the things that they evolved to do eventually. Build structures, dams, boats, seafaring.
Sure.
All those things took place afterwards, right?
Sure.
So there has to be a timeline for all innovation
No,
anyway.
I'm responding to your point. Was the climate shift the trigger for
Right.
agriculture?
It had to be the trigger for something, right?
What I'm saying
whenever
is
there's
that-
a massive a change in the environment, people adapt to that change. And if you look at the sophistication levels of societies over the course of hundreds of thousands of years, they always move towards a more sophisticated. They figure out new ways, new methods. They get better at things. It just makes sense that they would eventually figure out agriculture.
In this area, there were multiple attempts to figure out agriculture.
Right, but
they
there
only
was
come
also probably multiple attempts to figure out how to make a boat before they figured out how to make a submarine. right?
I mean, so I tend to think that what we see with our record is it's very heterogeneous. So that's why we see agriculture showing up at different times in different places. And so I think that that's really key to get across. I do think that this climatic change, it introduced more CO2, it introduced more humidity and rainfall that made agriculture actually possible, sort of as an intensive undertaking to do. And so I think that that's really important to acknowledge, but I don't want to sort of say that human agency didn't have something to do with that, because humans were the ones that chose to change from just gathering to planting.
Right.
And so I think that's really, really key to demonstrate.
I want to get to Egypt because I think it's one of the most bizarre accomplishments of human beings, and the age of Egypt is a fascinating piece of discussion, because whatever it is, I mean, one of the more fascinating things is Robert Schoch out of Boston University, the geologist who examined the erosion in the Temple of the Sphinx and determined it to be thousands of years of rainfall, and which would predate the Sphinx by quite a bit, because this is all stone that had been moved by human beings, and it had been used to construct the Sphinx, and this Temple of the Sphinx has been carved out. It's very clear that it was carved out, and you see these massive fissures that look exactly like water erosion. He specifically said that he showed these images to other geologists without telling them what they were looking at, and they almost unanimously said that it was water erosion over thousands of years of rainfall. And then when he would show them exactly what he was telling them to describe, then they didn't want to have any part of it, because they're like, okay, now you're saying something that's really crazy, because now you're saying that this structure is 11,000 years old as opposed to 4,500 years old.
Surprise, surprise, I'm going to disagree with you.
Shall we look at?
Well, it's not me. It's Robert
No,
Schoch.
Robert Schoch.
Shall we look
yeah.
at some images of the
Yes.
Sphinx?
Yeah.
I
Let's look at images of the water erosion,
Yeah.
because it's
and then I'll show some images of the quarries nearby.
Let's do that.
Yeah.
So if you could me up again. And again, credit to my wife Santa, who has taken every risk with me, every step, every dive for the last 30 plus years. This is her photograph of the Sphinx enclosure and of the Sphinx temple,
How'd she
so-called,
get that picture?
in the helicopter.
Wow.
Back in the mid-90s. Sphinx temple directly in front of the Sphinx, so-called, and the Bali temple to the left as we view it. And you can see that the Sphinx is a rock-hewn structure cut out of the bedrock with a trench around it. And if we go in here, the notion that the Sphinx bears the marks of precipitation-induced weathering is an evolution of an idea that the late great John Anthony West had many years ago. You've had John on your show
Yes,
before.
twice. Yeah,
He's a dear friend of mine.
he was great. Magical Egypt. I can't recommend it enough. It's such a
Fascinating material.
He has two of them, two series. I think there's like 3 DVDs in each one, and it's just incredible stuff. Just on the undisputable things about the construction methods and how fascinating it is that they built these things.
Marvelous, out-of-the-box
Yeah.
thinker. I miss
Yeah.
him so much. He was a
He was
dear
amazing.
friend. It was he who brought Robert Schoch to the Giza Plateau. Robert took a look at the erosion around the Sphinx and eventually came to the conclusion that the best explanation for it was that this Sphinx enclosure had been subjected to at least 1,000 years of extremely heavy rainfall. And Robert Schoch right now puts that back to around the 10,000 BC date, 12,000 plus years ago, during the Epic Days, when indeed there were heavy rains in Egypt. And it's these deep vertical fissures in the side of the enclosure wall which most clearly demonstrate what it's talking about. The rainwater pouring off the edge of the plateau would have selectively cut out the softer areas of rock and created these fissures that we see through it, and this rounded scallop profile in Robert Schoch's view and in mine.
I've had Robert Schoch on as well.
Yeah.
We talked about it for a long time.
And I want to pay tribute to Robert Schoch here. He and I have had our differences, but Robert Schoch, in my view, is a hero. Robert Schoch is a mainstream academic who has stuck his neck out for an idea that is very unpopular with mainstream academics. He's taken all the risks for his career, he's put himself out there, and he's spoken his truth. And I want to respect Robert Schoch. I want to express that respect and kudos to Robert Schoch for everything he's done. He's helped to advance this field enormously and to allow people to think previously unthinkable thoughts.
And I've seen him attack
Mercilessly. This happens again and again.
So,
Now, I'll just complete this point because it's often said that the Sphinx was the work of the pharaoh Khafre, and that these two temples were the work of the pharaoh Khafre, particularly the Vali temple that you see on the right there. There's no inscriptions in the Sphinx temple, but when we come to the Vali temple, what we're looking at is a limestone core, and those limestone blocks were actually taken out of the Sphinx trench, which was then faced in a later time with granite. And there's a quote from Robert Schoch there, who's saying that basically the original temples were limestones and that they were faced with granite. Now, that's the interior of the temple. You can see that there's definitely two phases of construction there. There's the granite, no dispute that that's Old Kingdom Egypt. And then there's the limestone massive megalithic walls behind it, which are heavily eroded, as you can see even from here. Now, interestingly, is that temple really associated with the pharaoh Khafre? In 1947, I.E.S. Edwards, who was one of the leading Egyptologists of his time, wrote this: around each doorway is a band of hieroglyphic inscription giving the name and titles of the king. No other inscriptions or relief occur anywhere else in the building. That's been taken to assume that the name of the king was given as Khafre. Actually, Edwards corrected himself in 1993. Around each doorway was carved a band of hieroglyphic inscription giving the name and titles of the king, but only the last words, beloved of the goddess Bastet and beloved of the goddess Hathor, are preserved. No other inscriptions occur anywhere else in the building. In other words, there's nothing in that temple that directly connects it to the pharaoh Khafre. But what's interesting is the way that granite facing, which certainly was done in the Old Kingdom, has actually been, the interior of the granite has actually been cut to match the heavily weathered limestone that it's covering. It's been cut to shape that. They're honoring and respecting that ancient structure. And so in my opinion, the geological evidence on the antiquity of the Sphinx is strong. There's no doubt that the ancient Egyptians were there, that they did work on the Sphinx. The head of the Sphinx was recarved into a human head. I and my colleagues believe it was originally the head of a lion, but the Sphinx was an entire lion.
but the evidence that it's been carved is that it has far less erosion than the rest of the body. Correct.
And also the head is way out of proportion to the rest of the body. That's an issue, because one thing the ancient Egyptians were pretty good at when they put their minds to it was proportion. And the disproportionate size of the head of the Sphinx in relation to the whole body of the Sphinx.
I mean, if you look at other ancient Egyptian sphinxes, they also have small heads. If you put my head on a lion, it would look small. And they
well,
all
indeed,
look relatively small.
Indeed, it would look small. That's the point. It was a lion before, and it was cut. It was heavily eroded, and it was then cut down into a human head.
But it does have a distinctly different form of erosion.
No, that's actually where I'd come and disagree with you. I have some photos as well.
What's your
It looks
evidence that
way
it was
less
connected to
eroded.
Khafre?
The head. Oh yeah, and I
The
can
head
show you
looks
why.
way
Yeah,
less
because
eroded.
it's a different stratum of the natural limestone.
I see.
So if you look at the geology of the area, are you finished, Graham? If not, I'll put up some slides.
Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, let's do this. So first off, I want to sort of show this is what it looks like, even the neck. You don't see the neck today because because they expanded the headdress as a support for the head. And so the point is that there's these different layers of this limestone here that we can understand geologically. And so there's this very dense limestone that's up by the head, and then the rest of the limestone is much more fragile and porous. So I do want to be clear, how do we date the Sphinx? What kind of evidence archaeologically are we using? And so what that comes from is largely radiocarbon dates from the pyramids themselves. So pieces of wood that were in between the blocks of the pyramids have been radiocarbon dated and definitively tell us that the pyramids were built during the Old Kingdom, right?
But didn't they do work on the pyramids in multiple stages where they would probably like reseal things and surface things and clean things? If they were constructed 12, 13, 20,000 years ago and people were still inhabiting them 5,000 years ago, wouldn't it make sense that they would do things to them?
Well, we have inscriptions in there from areas that are sealed off from the actual construction, graffiti from the workmen referring to, for example, Friends of Khufu and different workmen gangs that are in there. And these are in areas...
It's graffiti, like they
You
tagged
know
it?
Yeah, they tagged it, exactly.
You know
And
that
these
that particular graffiti in the Khufu cartouche has long been suggested
except it uses versions of Khufu's name that were not known until later by scholars. And so that's
What versions of it?
I don't know, man. I don't read hieroglyphs. I
Where'd you
read
get that information?
Egyptologists.
Where'd you get that information?
I got that.
Sawi Hwas.
No, not from Sahi Hawass. I've never met Sahi Hawass. I got that information from reading, man. But okay, so let's go back. How do we know that these radiocarbon dates with the blocks in the pyramid relate to the Sphinx itself? Because the Sphinx is just hewn out of natural stone, right? These different layers here. So the reason we know is because geochemists have done stone sourcing on the chemistry of these stones in the pyramids. And they've been able to trace them to different quarries at Giza. And so this is photos of different quarries and cuttings for the quarries. And so they've taken samples from the quarries themselves and from the stones in the pyramids. They do different kinds of geochemical analyses to show the ratios of, in this case, magnesium and iron. And then they trace them back to specific quarries there. And so they know that a bunch of the stones from Khafre, for example, come from the area of the Sphinx. The Sphinx is from a quarry. It's a quarry site for those stones. And so one of the things
Go back to that slide for a second.
yeah.
Okay.
And so this is a photo of some of these quarries, and I want to point out that the quarry walls look a lot like exactly the walls of the Sphinx itself. It has the same kind of erosion on it. It has the same kind of rough working on it. And so what you're actually seeing with the Sphinx is you're seeing this roughened shape from quarrying, which is then built with nicer stones around it.
Right, but we're talking about the temple, the Sphinx, the outside structures, what Robert Schoch was discussing. That shows much more clear indication of the water erosion. Not necessarily this, which shows a lot of kind of different erosion.
By the way, this restoration on the paws of the Sphinx is not.
Yes, that is
yeah,
modern. I'm not going to deny that. But what I'm trying to explain to you is that we can't. A, I don't think that anybody really agrees with Schoch that it is erosion. B, if it is
can't say
erosion,
that.
well, a lot of geologists do not, nor do
But many geologists do. Many geologists do agree with it.
Very few.
I think it's quite a bit. Graham, you would know more than I do.
I think it's quite a bit too, but it doesn't really matter to me. I think whether geologists.
Oh, I don't know. This might be it. This might be it.
He's spoken his truth.
Oh,
He's made his case.
are you
I think he's
serious?
strong.
No.
And what I'm trying to do is present the evidence that goes against him, right?
But when you look at those fissures that are in that wall,
You see the same thing on quarries there. You know, it's the same exact kind of fissures on this is just a completely different quarry in a different area of
that's
Giza.
not the most specific example of it, though. There are other examples of that wall.
And so I mean,
There's other
you know,
examples of that wall that are much more rounded out.
so I have
and
been
they
to
dip
Giza,
in.
by the way.
See, this doesn't look the same to me.
Wait, but I have a reason for saying that. I've been to
Okay.
Giza. The one time I went to Giza, it rained. In fact, the taxi got into an accident because the oil on the road got so slick that we were hit from behind.
Right, it does rain.
Very minor fender bender, but the
Right, but
point
you're
is,
not denying
but
that
how do you
the climate
date
radically changed in
how
that
do you
area.
date erosion like this? That takes a lot of experimentation, and I've seen no evidence that shows how to date this kind of erosion to 12,000 years ago or something.
Are
like
you
that.
in control of the thing now? Is that what's
I
going
am,
on?
and I was going to show
Graham,
some.
can you show images from what you were looking at when it shows the water erosion? Because it looks very different. The images that Graham was showing from where Robert Schoch did his work, it's much more extreme. The ones that you have are from a distance, and the other ones are kind of blurry, and you're looking at it and it looks similar. But like
I was there in 2003. So it's
I'm
been a
sure
long
you
time.
were. I'm sure you were. But this is different. The fissures in there are different. They really look like water flow. And if you're talking about the different layers of stone, which are softer in some layers and harder in other, if you did have that kind of water flowing through it, it would make sense that the softer layers would be more eroded. And that's Robert Schoch's contention.
And how are you going to date that though to however long ago? One of the other key disproved.
But don't you date
I'm
it
not
though?
controlling the
But
slides.
don't you date it though by the amount of rainfall that we know took place at a certain
No,
time?
Because a small amount of rainfall can also cause erosion, especially in a dry environment. So
Right,
in
but if
very
it
dry
couldn't cause
environments, a
that-
tiny amount of rainfall can actually damage things even worse because things are so dry.
But that level of erosion?
Well, but you need to come up with some independent way of dating it,
Okay.
right? And that's where the issue is. What we do have is independent confirmation that the blocks in the pyramids came from the quarry right there.
Right.
And we have dates on those blocks from radiocarbon dates of wood in between those blocks.
There's an area where my work is misunderstood.
Yeah, pretty. They're pretty crazy.
And of the megalithic temples in front of the Sphinx.
Oh, wow,
I've
insane.
never claimed that the pyramids are 12,000 years old.
Oh, no, I know it didn't say.
I didn't say
know
it did
some
either.
I didn't
people
know the
do, though.
Some people
details.
do.
Yeah, some people do.
I've never claimed that. I do not seek to divorce the ancient
That is
Egyptians.
why I brought up
from
the
the Great
notion
Pyramids.
that they'd been resurfaced, because
Yeah.
that's the claim.
Yeah, I've heard that claim as
That
well.
people have been living in them for thousands of years, and so that the material that you're dating is from that time period.
Yeah.
And what do you make of the hieroglyphs that show kingdoms going back 30,000 years?
I've never heard that, so I have no comment.
It's in all the king lists of the.
Oh,
ancient
you mean the dating of that? Yeah, well, so there's a lot of issues with the
That's
way that
true.
those are dated because they're not precisely dated. It's just generations. So it's about how you interpret that kind of stuff. But it's still, it becomes an issue of mythology. Are they adding in extra generations there and stuff like that?
Or are they actually reporting their truthful memory of their past?
Well, but we'd want to have directly dated evidence of that. We
You
do
might want to have that.
Well, yeah, I think if we're going to talk about archaeological evidence, we need directly dated stuff.
And one of the things that's fascinating
The
about this book
soothsayer.
is the discovery of older construction methods that are below,
You say lots of
very
sooths.
below the surface, that the different temples were built on previous construction.
I mean, that happens in every culture, where
Right.
you see sort of spaces being reused in
Right,
different ways.
Right. but
Temple
how
of
much-
Horus at Edfu, where the Atlantis story is told in an ancient Egyptian context, is a good example of that. 'Cause the Temple of Horus at Edfu was just the latest incarnation of a series of older temples that stood on that site. Is a regular issue.
Right. And so how much time are we talking about then? So if we go back to 4,500 years ago, which is the established date of the construction of the Great Pyramid, right? Somewhere around then?
Edfu dates to the Ptolemaic period, so it's actually after Plato. So can I talk a second
But
about
what-
Edfu?
No,
when you-
we'll come to that. I think it'd be really good to talk about Edfu and Atlantis.
All right, briefly though,
let's-
we've been
these-
doing this for a
these-
long time.
Yeah, I know. It's great. Everybody's hanging in there. But these temples that were built on these older temples, what time period is ascribed to them? Like, what's the oldest construction?
Oh, in the case of Edfu, it comes into the early Old Kingdom, the earliest, not prehistoric.
So what year?
Maybe 4,000 years ago.
And so what is the oldest construction that we're aware of in Egypt?
I mean, we have Neolithic buildings that go back, 8,000 years, something like 9,000 years.
I think the oldest construction we're aware of in Egypt is the Great Sphinx and the megalithic temples in front of it. That's my view.
I mean, but we have no evidence from the Giza Plateau of any occupation that early, and that's one of the most intensively explored archaeological landscapes in the world.
In terms of food,
In
seeds,
terms of
those-
anything, yeah. In terms of artifacts or seeds or food, we have nothing that dates back that.
The question is, like, what would be left?
Well, we'd find stuff just like we find stuff everywhere. I mean,
Is it there a point of no return though? Like, is there a time period, whether it's 20,000 or 30,000 years ago, where all the stuff you're looking for would have already been consumed by the earth?
no, because when you work in stone, this
Stone
survives.
tools,
yeah, stone
yeah.
tools.
But what about
Fire pottery, bones themselves are going to survive in that kind of environment.
what do we think they used to transport these stones, cut these stones, place them, and how did they have a mathematical understanding of geometry to the point where they could put together this immense structure of 2,300,000 stones? If you think about everybody else that was alive 4,500 years ago, you don't think of anything even remotely sophisticated as Egypt.
I don't know. I think what we're starting to see is that there is a lot more stuff that's very
Right, but there's
sophisticated at that
nothing
time.
like the Great Pyramid.
Look, in terms of like visual striking stuff, I agree.
Also
but-
accomplishment.
Yeah, and I mean, but the Egyptians tell us that they do it. They tell us the names of their engineers that design it, like Imhotep, and they have depictions of them moving enormous stones and statues that take 50, 60 people. They do it on sand. Here, wait, I have this booted up in my Google. If you want, Jamie. This is from later, but sorry, I hate Google sometimes. But this is from a little later. I think it's New Kingdom, but it shows people moving this enormous statue, and so what they're actually doing is doing it on sand. Come on, Washington Post.
And what year is this image from?
Oh God, I think it's New Kingdom, so maybe 2,500 years ago or something. No, more than that. 3,000 years ago. But what they're showing is they do it on a sledge right here,
A sled.
and then they pour water on the sand so that it can actually help move it. And so it makes it actually doable to move something that large. And so, I mean, I just want to get back to the point that, look, humans
But
are smart people.
Can I ask you this though? Is this is 2,000 years ago?
Probably more like 3,000.
Isn't that after these things were made?
Well, no, because the Egyptians kept constructing large things.
So they did have
Yeah.
things like this that they
Yeah.
made during this time
They stopped
period.
building pyramids, but they still built enormous temples like the Karnak.
And these
stuff
enormous
like that.
statues.
Yeah, exactly.
Sliding megalithic statues on wet sand. I'm not disputing that, but what I'm wondering is how you get a series of actually dozens of 70-ton granite blocks up to 300 feet above the base of the pyramid to form the ceiling of the king's chamber and the floor and the ceilings of the relieving chambers above the king's chamber. No matter how much wet sand you've got, you're not going to get them 300 feet in the air.
Levers?
Never what levers?
Yeah, levers made of wood. We can find this
No,
online
hang on.
YouTube.
Levers made of wood. You've been to Gyges, you know what they're about.
Yeah,
They're envisaging a ground
it's possible.
to bring
Yeah.
the stones up to that.
I'm envisaging very smart people with large labor forces and the equipment
Me
needed to do
too.
this.
I'm envisaging that
Yeah.
too, but I find it difficult to see how your wet sand example gets
No, this was an
70
example
ton
of how-
gets 70-ton granite blocks 300 feet in the air.
But you've got to make the concession that there's such a jump between what these people were able to do and what everybody else was able to do. There's such a difference.
I mean, I think
There's
they're just
such a
doing
difference.
something different is how I'd put it.
It's not just
Sure.
doing something different, it's doing something on a scale that no one is doing 4,500 years ago. That scale's insane. I mean,
cool. It's cool as
it's
hell.
cool as hell, but it's also, it's so different.
Yeah.
It's as different to the rest of the world as to hunter-gatherer civilizations that are in the Amazon to people that are living in Manhattan.
And that's
It's
why
so
even in the
different.
Roman period, Egypt was a tourist destination. You
Mhm.
know, to go there and see these marvels. And so ever since they've been built, it's become a tourist destination because they're so visually striking and they really grab at everybody's imagination, right? And so there's something very enigmatic about that. But I don't want to sort of say, just because it's enigmatic and mysterious, that we should not give credit to these people because they
No,
were
it's the same
smart people.
No
yeah,
one's saying don't give credit to these people. I think even people that are dating Egypt back, like if the hieroglyphs that date it back to more than 30,000 years, it's the same people. No one's saying it's different people that did it. What everyone's saying is like, how did they achieve the level of sophistication that they absolutely undeniably
sucks.
had at the very most recent 4,500 years ago? So
There's
just that alone, like,
There-
what the fuck was going on there?
There's a
Yeah.
date stamp at Giza. And this concerns another issue between
Because
us
that one really
is
sucks.
what counts as evidence? What can we regard as evidence? Archaeology dismisses the Great Sphinx as evidence for an older civilization on the grounds that we've put. Can't be presented as evidence for an older civilization. And the other thing that archaeology tends to dismiss is mythology and tradition. Can I give a small, quick presentation which has much to do with Egypt and much to do
Sure.
with what impassions me about this subject, and then we'll come back to. So this is another one of Santa's amazing pictures of the Great Pyramid from the air. The ancient Egyptians spoke of a time called Zep Tepi, the first time, when the gods walked the earth. If we're going to find out when that was, you need to have knowledge of an obscure astronomical phenomenon called the precession of the earth. Now we all know that everybody's heard the song, we live in the dawning of the age of Aquarius. Actually, this connects to this idea. Because the Earth wobbles on its axis and is the viewing platform from which we observe the stars, it changes the times that particular stars rise in times of year, and it changes the positions of those stars in the sky as viewed from the Earth. Right now, at dawn on the spring equinox, the sun rises against the background of the constellation of Pisces. We live, if you like, in the age of Pisces, and we will do for the next 100 years or so. Because of the precessional wobble, we're going to move into the age of Aquarius in about 100 years. That just means that the constellation of Aquarius will house the sun on the spring equinox in that time because of the precessional wobble. And these shifts take place at the rate of about 1 degree every 72 years. Now, the discoverer of precession discovery is attributed to a Greek astronomer and mathematician called Hipparchus. And we're looking at 127 BC. But these guys, Giorgio de Santillana and Hertha von Deschend, in an amazing piece of work called Hamlet's Mill, strongly dispute that. And they suggest that we're looking at an extremely ancient knowledge of procession, worldwide heritage of a lost civilization to which all subsequent civilizations in all parts of the globe, forgetful of the source of the precious legacy they receive, are the ungrateful heirs. Giorgio de Santillana was professor of the history of science at MIT. Hertha von Deschend was professor of the history of science at Frankfurt University, so they're no lightweights. They refer to the fact that a series of numbers keep cropping up in ancient myths all around the world, associated with imagery. And those numbers are all based on the number 72. I have to be quick about this, but 72 divided by 2 is 36. 72 plus 36 is 108. 108 divided by 2 is 54. There's a whole series of numbers in ancient mythology, far more ancient than the Greeks, which deploy these numbers. They go back into the Rig Veda in written forms and much, much earlier than that. If we go to Angkor in Cambodia, an amazing site. Again, somebody took this from a helicopter back in the 90s. You'll find at Angkor a myth displayed on the walls, and that's called the churning of the Milky Ocean. And here we see the great serpent wrapped around the body of Mount Mandara, and teams of demons and angels are pulling on the body of the serpent, and this is seen as an image of precession, of the processional wobble by Santillana and von Deschend. And they point out that it's not only expressed in myth, but also in architecture. So at Angkor Thom, we've got 108 statues on the bridge. That's a processional number. It's 72 plus 36, 54 on each side. And it's the churning of the Milky Ocean by Mount Mandara that's being displayed there. Angkor Wat is, like the Great Pyramid, is aligned to within a fraction of a single degree of true north, south, east, and west. And on the spring equinox, if you go to Angkor and stand at the end of that long causeway right in the center, you'll observe this, and you'll only observe it then. You'll observe the sun rising directly over the central tower and sitting on top of the central tower of Angkor Wat. This site, nobody disputes it, is an equinoctial marker. It's designed to celebrate the spring equinox. And that's what you see at that time and at that time only. Let's jump over to Egypt now. When we come to the Nile Delta, here's the Great Pyramid. Now, I'll give you some statistics. It's 481.39 feet high originally. It's a bit lower today. It lost some 30 feet from its top in an earthquake. Footprint of the base, 13.1 acres. Weight, 6 million tons. 2.3 million blocks. Lost casing stones also came off in that earthquake. 115,000 of them weighing 10 tons each, covering an area of 22 acres. Angle of slope is 52 degrees. And this monument is aligned to within 3/60ths of a single degree of true north. Why do I pick 3/60ths? Because degrees are divided into 60 minutes. So we're talking about 3 arc minutes, a tiny fraction of a single degree of error in the Great Pyramid. The Great Pyramid seems to be speaking to the earth. It's not only aligned almost precisely to true north, it's placed very close to latitude 30, 1/3 of the way between the equator and the North Pole. And most mysteriously of all, if you take the height of the Great Pyramid and multiply it by 43,200, which is a precessional number, it's one of those numbers, you get the polar radius of the Earth. And if you measure the base perimeter of the Great Pyramid and multiply it by the same number, you get the equatorial circumference of the Earth. So we have a monument that is perfectly aligned to geographical north, and that encodes the dimensions of the Earth on a scale based on a key motion of the Earth itself, the precession of the Earth's axis. This to me is very clever. Now, I'm not going to support that here, there's not much time, but if anybody wants to freeze the frame and look at this slide, all this information comes from IES Edwards about the statistics of the Great Pyramid and the calculations of it. Now, there's the Giza Plateau, there's our 3 Great Pyramids. It's hard to, can you see the Sphinx in this, Clint? How about you, Joe?
Is that in the left-hand corner?
Yeah, it's in the left there. It's in the left there. It's 270 feet long, but you can see how it's kind of dwarfed by the pyramids in the back there. The Great Sphinx looks over the Nile Valley. That's the Nile Valley. And the Great Sphinx is oriented perfectly due east. We've talked about the erosion of the Sphinx. This is the view from the back of the Sphinx's head. If you were there at the summer solstice, you would see the sun rising very far to the left, far to the north of east. If you were there at the winter solstice, you'd see the sun rising very far to the south, south of east. But if you're there on the spring equinox, you see the Sphinx is looking directly at the rising sun, just like Antarctica. It's an equinoctial moment, clearly there to celebrate the equinoctial moment. And we find the same kind of metaphor of a whirling, churning process taking place in ancient Egypt, for example, here. The question then becomes, was there a time when the lion sphinx looked at the lion in the sky? And yes, there was a time when the lion sphinx looked at the lion in the sky. And that time is around 12,600 years ago. It's not a single moment, it's an epoch of several hundred years. But the constellation of Leo, who's the age of Leo, was rising, housing the sun 12,600 years ago. Precession can be used to fix the date of monuments, still is today. The Hoover Dam has a star map built into it, which freezes the skies above the Hoover Dam. And the reason that is there, the architect said, in remote ages to come, intelligent people with knowledge of precession would be able to discern the astronomical time of the dam's construction. So let's use this precessional tool to consider the age of the whole Giza Plateau. I strongly reaffirm, I do not insist that the pyramids are 12,000 years old. I do insist that the Sphinx is 12,000 years old. I think it's a very strong argument that Robert Schoch has made. But I do think the ground platforms for the Sphinx were there. I think that for the pyramids were there 12,000 years ago, and I think the project was completed much later by the ancient Egyptians. You need to know a bit about Egyptian mythology. The god Osiris, who walked the earth in the legendary Zep-Tepi the first time, murdered by 72 conspirators, another one of those processional numbers, eventually becomes the ruler of the ancient Egyptian afterlife kingdom, which is called the Duat, which is both an underworld and a region of the sky. And here's Robert Raval's Orion correlation. And one of Robert's strongest critics is Ed Krupp from the Griffith Observatory in Los Angeles, who doesn't accept the correlation. Nevertheless, he does accept that according to the pyramid text, the pharaoh rose to the stars as Orion. Egyptian astronomy recognized Orion, at least his belt, as the celestial incarnation of Osiris. And I want to pay tribute to Robert Raval. He's another researcher in this alternative field who has suffered massive, heart-rending attacks by the academic establishment, and yet who has contributed a key idea that is worthy of further consideration. One of the reasons I don't separate the Great Pyramids from the ancient Egyptians is that there are 4 shafts cut through the body of the Great Pyramid, and this is not disputed. The southern shaft of the King's Chamber points directly at the belt of Orion, specifically at the lowest of the 3 stars, as it crosses the meridian, which is the north-south line in the sky. In the epoch that the pyramids are supposedly built, around 2,500 BC. And so do all the other 4 shafts also target stars in that epoch, the epoch of 2,500 BC. But when we come back to the Sphinx, we have to remember this alignment is slow. It would have remained recognizable for more than 1,000 years, roughly the end of dryness, roughly from 12,800 to 11,600 years ago. What confronts us at Giza, in my view, is a 3-dimensional representation of the sky of about 12,800 to 11,600 years ago. We have the Sphinx looking due east at the constellation of Leo. At the moment the sun bisects the horizon, we find that the constellation of Orion is sitting due south on the meridian with its 3 belt stars in the same pattern as the 3 great pyramids on the ground. And not only that, but precession has caused the orientation of the belt stars to change. In 2,500 BC, they were in the wrong orientation. 10,500 BC, they're in the right orientation. And I'm just asking, are we looking at the date stamp of Zep-Tepi, the first time written in the astronomical language of precession? And lastly, in case anybody doubts that we've made up these images, these are shots from Stellarium. This is 10,600 BC. This is the due east view from Giza, looking at the constellation of Leo, rising in direct line with the gaze of the Sphinx. As the sun breaks the horizon, Leo is a bit higher. If we look due south at that moment, we'll see the constellation of Orion sitting due south on the meridian. And finally, we have Orion and the Sphinx in this single image. These are genuine images from Stellarium. Anybody can have a computer software program and go look at the ancient skies. And the ancient skies tell us that there's this astonishing connection between the Sphinx and its equinoctial alignment and the constellation of Leo, and between the Great Pyramids and the constellation of Orion as it looked.
Flint, what is your take on this, the understanding of the processional equinoxes? Do you buy it?
Unsurprisingly, no. So let me explain.
Okay.
So my issue here, there's a bunch of things that Graham talked about, and I have replies to a few different ones. And then I'd like to do the quick sensation. This has been a long conversation.
Yeah.
I think the issue with the lion facing Leo rests on that assumption. So obviously it's facing the sunrise. It even aligns reasonably well with the equinox, but we don't have any examples of, say, a constellation sign facing another constellation sign. It's a one-off example that, as I started at the very beginning, archaeology is built upon patterns. And so a one-off example to me is not convincing that that's the intention of that, is to have it facing Leo, because we only have this one example. And it's an interesting idea, but I don't see it as proven at all. If we want to get into some of the math, so look, I had surgery this last year, and I was listening to one of your podcasts, Graham, while I was zonked out of my mind on painkillers. And
That must have been fun.
oh yeah, and so it wasn't a Joe Rogan podcast. It was a different one you did. But so I wanted to check out this math about the pyramid, and so I know that you did not originate with this math, but you use it a lot to explain how cultures see the procession. And so in a sense, you take the height of the pyramid, 146.5 meters. You're trying to see how it relates to the polar radius of the Earth, 6,356,000 meters. And then you're using this precession number, 72, which is the amount that the Earth's wobble changes by 1 degree is 72 years. And so you multiply it by 43,200. Why is that a precessional number? Because that's 72 times 600. And I checked it. I checked it in different kinds of things. If you do it in feet, or you do it in a metric system, it works, right? Because that's how math works. So with multiplication, it's going to be transferable to different kind of units, and it's 99.57% accurate. But then I thought to myself, wait a second, can we find this elsewhere? And sure enough, as Graham states, you can. So I went to my own backyard, the Parthenon in Greece. And the Parthenon has 46 inner columns plus 23 outer columns for a total of 69 columns, which I think is a pretty cool number in and of itself. You got 69. And then you can multiply 69 by 576,000, which is also a processional number of 72 times 8,000. And you get 39,744,000, which is 99.17% accurate to the global circumference of the Earth. And kind of my point here, though, is that this will work for everything, because you have such a large number. You can solve it yourself. So let's take 420. We all love 420, right? So you just do this backwards. You take the polar radius of the Earth, 6,356,000, divide that by 420, divide it by our precession 72, and you get the solution to this problem, which is 210.185. Let's round that to 210, which is pretty cool because that's half of 420. Plus it's 3 times 7 times 10. And then when you do it in reverse, 420 times 15,120, which is that processional number of 72 times 210, and you get 6,350,400. It's 99.91% accurate, more accurate than the height of the Great Pyramid. So every time you smoke a joint, you are connecting with the Earth mathematically. The reality is that math is there to find relationships between numbers. And so we can go and find those very easily if we work them out. And I'm not saying that you did this in reverse. I'm saying that we're always going to find mathematical relationships between such numbers. And so that's what I think is really important here to think about, that it's always going to be there if you look. It's not something that the Egyptians necessarily encoded in there. That's a large assumption, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. What doesn't make sense to me is, how do you think they were able to align the pyramid, the true north, south, east, and west within such a slight degree of error? And do you think they had knowledge at all about the precessional equinoxes?
For the second one, I'd say I see no evidence of knowledge of the precessional equinoxes in ancient Egyptian architecture. In terms of the first question, aligning it with true north, there's different ways you can do that with the North Star Or by even on an equinox, if you hold up an obelisk or a stick and you trace the shadow that it makes, you're going to end up getting true north, south, east, west. And so there's different ways that they could have worked out what true north was. Which one they used, I'm not sure.
But the level of accuracy, it's just,
Smart people.
yeah,
Smart
but
people.
just be kind of beyond smart. That's what freaks me out about the whole subject. It's like, how was this, regardless of the argument about the date, whatever it is, humans built it. They did somehow. They made something that is so immense and so mind-blowing that today we just scratch our heads and say how.
Yeah, and I think that that's such a cool thing when you think about the past. You know, they didn't have TV, they didn't have Joe Rogan to listen to, they had the stars above them. And so, you know, I fully agree with Graham that a lot of ancient cultures are looking at the stars, and we can track different times when they're aligning things with solstices, equinoxes, or different.
What do you make of what looks like ancient drill marks and all these different bizarre ways it seems like they were carving the stones out? That's kind of inexplicable.
Yeah, see, I'm not sure if I'd say it's inexplicable. You oftentimes see those drill marks, and so they're not as precise as some people always claim online and stuff like that.
Not just that they were precise, but that it required a drill that moved at an insane speed.
Well, I think it required a lot of
insanely
sand. It was the
hard.
abrasion of the sand that actually did that. And so it's the sand itself is just slowly abrading down the granite. And
With a core, but
Yeah.
coring it. Like, what would you use to do that?
a drill made of copper or bronze, and then sand and water. Yeah,
Has
there's.
that ever been shown to be possible to
Yeah,
do that?
I
To
think
have
it's
that kind of
Scientists
results?
Against Myths on YouTube that has
They've done those core samples, like they've dug into the
they've,
stone
they've
like
drilled
that.
into granite like that. Yeah.
I know that they tried to cut them, and it took a long ass time.
Oh, yeah.
Like sawing back and forth.
I think that's what we need to think about. Is this takes a long ass time. It's a huge achievement of human energy and things like that.
I'd like to. I'd like to just finish on this point. It's not one thing. It's two things. It's the three pyramids on the ground and their relationship to Orion at the same moment that the Sphinx, equinoctially targeted, very precisely, not so perfectly due east, is gazing at its celestial counterpart in the sky, and the Milky Way is in position over the Nile River as well. So it's a picture of the sky that we're looking at Giza. Picture of the sky 12,600 years before our time that we're looking at Giza. And I don't think that's a coincidence. I think that's a deliberate, intentional date stamp that's been placed on that place. It's not just one monument, it's a whole complex of monuments on Giza, which are being put on the ground to mirror the sky at that time. And I think it's worth taking seriously. I think it's worth investigating. And then we add the issue of the erosion of the Sphinx to this, which also puts it back to 12,000 years. And I think it's unfortunate that archaeology is so hurried to dismiss all of this and so unwelcoming to the possibility that we might be missing something in the human story.
Can I give a little conclusion myself?
Sure, please do.
All right. Jamie, do you mind if I can share my slides? First of all, I really want to express thank you to both of you for having me.
Thank you.
And
Thanks for coming.
I want to say I'm not here to tell people what to believe. I really am not. I'm here to try to share the kind of evidence that we have and what archaeologists actually do. And I really do strongly believe that we do update with new evidence. I think that every single paper we publish is trying to change the paradigm of how we see the past with new methods, new evidence, and new things like that. And what we're starting to realize is that humans were very resilient and very innovative. We're seeing these mammoth bone structures going back 30,000 years, something like that, 20,000 years. I think I got that date wrong. It's been a long chat. But so we're seeing this evidence for sort of major hunter-gatherer monuments that is growing and really changing our picture of who we are. But at the same time, I want to say that archaeology is very much about cultural heritage around the world. We need to give credit to the people that did things, and we need to really understand how modern people see their own cultural heritage and respect that. And so I just want to give a shout out to everybody listening from all over the world. Be proud of who you come from. But lastly, I have a couple things I want to say, but I want to say there's major threats to archaeology that are going on in the world right now. There was just a major BBC article from yesterday. Wales, where I am right now, there's a 20% across the board cut to cultural heritage in Wales. They're talking about closing the National Museum in Cardiff. The National Museum of Wales, one of the jewels of that sector there. And so I want to draw everybody's attention. I'll share the links with you guys to this petition in front of the Welsh Parliament to try to get this debated, because it's really important that these scale of cuts do not happen. Everybody that's listening, Graham, I think you and me can agree that archaeological research is important. You could not do the research you do without the kind of cultural heritage initiatives that happen.
Absolutely not. I couldn't do any of the work.
Yeah.
The work that's been done. And I've said that on this show.
I agree with you, and I want people to support the funding of archaeology, history. At Cardiff University, where I teach, there's threats to cut all ancient languages from the program, from the teaching program. Latin, ancient Greek, Sanskrit, and Hebrew. And so this is a huge deal. If you want to have people go out and do their own research, we need to have these kind of subjects available at public universities, like Cardiff University. One of the top archaeology departments in the world, it was just ranked just a few weeks ago in one of the world rankings as like in the top 20 or 30 in the world. It had just closed. Sheffield, where I learned how to study ancient animal remains. University of Sheffield just completely axed and destroyed a few years ago. And so what we're seeing is a complete defunding of the humanities and the social sciences and history and archaeology, anthropology, classical studies, and more. And so please, if we care about understanding these mysteries from the past, we need to fund being able to teach people. We need to fund the actual research into it.
Can I ask
yeah.
what's the motivation behind defunding archaeology?
Saving money.
Put on
I have no idea. New buildings. We don't actually cost that much. Most of our research is funded through grants that we competitively get, like my grant that I use to do my isotope analysis, or it's funded through private donations.
I can't understand how, with our knowledge of history, it's so fascinating that archaeology would somehow or another be underfunded.
Yeah, it's real bad. UNC Greensboro just cut their
so
anthropology archaeology
insane
department.
Yeah, it's crazy when you consider what our culture does spend money on.
Right.
Yes.
That it's not spending money
I'm with you.
on finding out who we are and where we came from. Finding out
It's
about
like,
our past.
is there better evidence that we're sick?
Yeah, it's very good evidence that we're sick.
That we don't want
We're-
funding of our
we
past?
wanna
We're
live
a
in the
sick
moment.
civilization.
Yeah.
We tick all the boxes for the next lost civilization.
Oh,
I'll get to that in a second.
oh no.
I would like to, since you've had your moment, do you have
Oh no,
more
I have just a couple more things to say, and then you can finish up as we agree. Sorry, we also face threats like looting. So the trade in archaeological artifacts usually comes from looting done by terrorists, different cartels around the world, and we need funding to protect sites and things like that. But I want to share that there's good archaeology on YouTube. I want to give a shout out to the World of Antiquities, Stefan Milo, Archaeology Tube. There's a new channel by Dr. Smithy Nathan that I think is really interesting. Pause this, go check out some of these channels. There's also a lot of really great archaeology podcasts. I want to give a big shout out to the Tales from Atlantis, The Dirt, Movies We Dig, and one that's not on here that I'm going to appear on next week, talking about the Bronze Age collapse and climate change in the Eastern Mediterranean, is Let's Talk About Myths, Baby, hosted by Liv Albert. So check those out. But lastly, I just want to talk about why it matters that we study the past. When we look at scholarship and understanding the collapse of societies, what we usually see is human resilience. It's not like everybody dies. People survive. It's the upper crust of society that disappears. It's the palaces, it's the political structures, it's the major temples, it's the monuments, it's the art. Normal people survive. And so what I want to say is, if you are wealthy and you're listening to this and you're worried about societal collapse, don't go and try to hide from it. You need to invest in our society. That is what your wealth and status is based upon, is our society itself. So you need to invest in the resilience of the people around you and not thinking that you can protect yourself. Because if you look at history, go read these books. Eric Klein's book comes out tomorrow. Guy Middleton's book goes all over the world and looks at collapse. It is the rich and the elites who get eaten. So we have to invest in everyone if we want to survive this. And my own research into climate change at the end of the Bronze Age, what it shows is that the ancient Greeks adapted too late. It took them hundreds of years to realize that the climate had dried, and it took them hundreds of years to adapt their food production systems. And so let's not do that. We understand how the world is changing around us. Let's listen to that and try to invest in our future. Everything we do, whether it's trading stocks, deciding how to fix our plumbing, deciding on what we're going to do, is based on our knowledge of the past. And so we need to invest in our knowledge from the past and what it can tell us so that we can act properly today. Thank you.
Ironically, you sound like you're preparing us for the collapse of civilization.
I already gave that interview.
It sounds like what you're saying.
Yeah.
Sounds like rich people better put your money back into society.
Exactly.
Or we're fucked. Graham, you want to wrap this up?
Yeah, it's been an interesting conversation, Flint, on this. So much, both from my side and yours, that we've not been able to touch on. My request to you is, I showed that clip where you were calling for a crusade against pseudo-archaeology. These pseudo-archaeology things. I believe your friend John Hoops, moderators of my Wikipedia page, which people cannot edit my Wikipedia page. It's blocked. Now, the request that I have is it necessary for archaeology to insult those of us who come from different perspectives and look at the past in a different way? Insult people like Robert Kennedy, insult people like George, insult people like John Hoops, who John Hoops had a horrible campaign against 20 times through to John died. John H. Jenkins died in 2018. Does mainstream archaeology have to insult us all the time in that way? Is it not possible to have a meeting of minds and say, well, here are a bunch of outsiders. We archaeologists think that they're completely crazy, but let's actually entertain them. Let's look at them. Let's not be so combative about this. When I first started working about this, big picture birds in 1995, I was immediately. It began immediately. BBC Horizon devoted a whole program to trying to rubbish my work and gave a platform to archaeology. Why do we need to have this conflict? Why is it not possible to have multiple platforms? Why ultimately does archaeology so much want to control the narrative about the past? And why do so by attaching notions like racism and white supremacy to people that archaeology disagrees with? Is it not possible to have disagreements that don't involve all of that? And I'll tell you frankly, I was hurt badly, wounded badly as a human being by this association that you were very largely responsible of my work with white supremacy, racism, and all the other stuff that's really at today's level. I don't think any of that was necessary. I don't think any of that got to grips with the fundamentals of my work or my ideas. It was just an attempt to write me off and to smear me. And I think it's most unfortunate, and perhaps if anybody can learn a lesson from this, it's actually, we're all on the same side. We're all looking at the past. We're all trying to solve the mystery of the past. Some of us are doing it in a rigorous scientific manner, in the manner that you are. Some of us are doing it in multiple different ways. I've devoted 30 years of my life to this subject. I'm passionate about this subject. It matters to me. I have never knowingly told a lie, although I am constantly accused of lying. I tell my truth, and I try to represent my truth as best as I can. And I believe that's true for the majority of people in the alternative field. Can't we have some kind of meeting of minds between alternative approaches to the past and the archaeological approach to the past? And is it not possible that something beautiful might grow out of that?
If I could speak to that, the problem is one of communication and this bizarre modern time where someone says something and a bunch of people attack that thing that someone says. There's a big difference between a rational, calm, kind person being able to have a disagreement with someone face to face. Because, like, I think today there were some contentious moments, but I think overall we set a very nice tone of just letting each side speak to what they believe and what the evidence shows and have a very, I think, a productive conversation about it. And I think part of the problem is most people don't have access to the people that are saying these things that they disagree with. So what do? They make a YouTube video, or they make a blog post, or they make a podcast, whatever it is, and they dispute it, and they attack that person, and maybe they insult that person, and maybe they connect that person to a bunch of horrible things because they're so emotionally invested in one side or the other side being correct, whether they're right or wrong. And I think it's a function that it's a part of how human beings aren't really meant to talk to each other that way. They're not meant to share ideas. They're meant to do this. Human beings are designed to sit down and talk to each other. And I think so much of our world's problems, other than obviously geopolitical issues and military issues, so much of our differences with each other, a lot of it is a lack of communication. We don't necessarily honestly communicate about things. And where you get a more nuanced understanding of who this person is you're talking to, where they stand, who they are, what their beliefs are, how do they get to these places? How do they, what caused them to think like this? And there's also the effect that it has on the person who's attacked, who wants to kind of attack back, which is very unproductive. It's very unproductive to carry around that pain. It's very unproductive to carry around that criticism. And it burdens you. It takes away resources from all other parts of your life. It can create stress. It can create a ripple effect that affects personal relationships, business relationships, all sorts of things in your life. Your health, whether or not you take care of yourself. You're so embattled in these conflicts of human beings that are almost mostly unnecessary, especially at that level, amongst kind, intelligent people that really just want to find out what's true.
A good statement.
Yeah, we can all be nicer to each other.
I agree with you.
I really believe that.
We can all be nicer, and it doesn't need to involve war and swear. And mobilize against actors. As I said, I've been involved with this culture of archaeology for 30 plus years. But the thing that hurt me the most is this bizarre association of me with racism, white supremacy, anti-Semitism and misogyny. All these words are in the Society for American Archaeology letter, which tried to get my show branded as science fiction.
So I mean, one thing that I would say is I read your books in the upcoming release of your show, right? And the tone between your books and the tone between your show is night and day. You were very combative.
What do you mean by the upcoming release of my show?
I meant back 2 years ago. Yeah.
So you read all my books?
No, several of them.
Okay.
You have a lot of books.
Because that's the other thing I'm going to pick you up on that. I'd like to say right now is that in a show like this, we've gone a bit, probably over 30 hours.
Oh yeah,
That's it. I'm done.
4 hours and 30 minutes.
But it's not enough. I've written a large number of books,
We'll
thoroughly
talk about
documented,
Edfutex and Atlantis next
thousands of
time.
footnotes. For those who'd like to evaluate my work, do check out the books. It can't be possibly sampled here, just as Flint's can't, on the basis of a 3-hour show. But I think we've done well. I think there is some kind of meeting of minds. I like you as a person.
But I hope that we change our tones on both ends because, like I said, the tone you chose in that show was offensive to archaeologists.
Yeah, that
And
was because I'd been offended by archaeologists for
I hear
30
you,
years.
but if we want to end this and take the temperature down,
Yep.
Yeah.
we have to think about how we do this, and we need to talk about different aspects of that in a friendly way.
Here.
So
Yeah,
are you still going to crusade against pseudo-archaeology?
Well, I
And
don't
what is it?
Well, I think, but the best way to crusade against stuff that's not correct is to do what you've done. Just come
That's
on.
why I
and-
agreed to come here.
Yeah,
okay?
it's great. And I think everybody's goal is the same. We want to find out what happened. Like what this incredible history of the human species. It's so bizarre, and especially when it comes to, I'm so fascinated with Egypt. That one to me is the craziest of crazy. Like what was going on there? Like what changed in the world that's not possible anymore? Societies like that don't exist, and how did they exist 4,500 years ago in this one place? I mean,
And they maintained their civilization for 3,000 years.
yes, it's crazy. And it was also a place rich with resources at the time. There's a lot of factors, right? But it's just that's the most important thing. It's like what happened, what was the process. So thank you, Flint, for coming on, and thank you for explaining all that stuff about grain and agriculture. That was really, really fascinating.
Next time I'll share my research on bones.